Iron Lake, Disc 4.
Rose opened the kitchen door. She wore an apron, and the aroma of baking cookies floated out around her. There were traces of flour in her dust-colored hair. "Christmas baking?" Cork hung his coat on a peg by the door. "My favorite time of year. I can bake to my heart's content. Would you like some milk and cookies?" Rose took a half-gallon carton of Meadow Gold from the refrigerator. Cork set his gym bag and the box of gifts and the rolled bearskin on the floor and went to the cookie jar on the counter by the sink. The cookie jar was shaped like Ernie from Sesame Street. Cork had bought it years before when Sesame Street was Jenny's favorite program. Now his daughter admired the darker visions of Sylvia Plath and was considering piercing her nose. Rose put a glass of milk on the table. Cork sat down. "So where is everyone?" Rose bent and peeked through the oven window. "Joe's working late with Sandy Parent. They're trying to straighten out things with Great North in light of the judge's suicide. Apparently everything's pretty complicated." "I'll bet," Cork agreed. "Jenny's on a date?" "Date?" Cork nearly choked. "She's only 14. "They've just gone to a movie." "Who'd she go with?" "Chuck Kubiak." "Don't know him," Cork said with a note of disapproval. "He's nice, Cork, really. He'll have her home by 11:30. The buzzer on the stove went off, and Rose took out a sheet of sugar cookies shaped like Christmas trees. "Anne's in her room," she went on, "asleep or reading, and Stevie's been down for hours." Cork watched his sister-in-law as she tapped colored sprinkles on the cookies. "How did we ever do without you, Rose?" "You didn't," she laughed. Which was almost true. She'd come just after Jenny was born, come to help for a few weeks while Joe finished law school. She never left. Although she was heavy then, she was heavier now, and at 35 was completely without the prospect of marriage in her own life. There were times when Cork felt sorry for Rose and guilty because all the care she could have given to a family of her own was lavished on his instead. "I put the guest room in order for you," Rose said as she wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "That's my last batch tonight. I'm going to bed." "Any idea when Joe—" Cork began. The back door opened before he finished speaking, and Joe stepped in. She took in the sight of Cork at the table and his things on the floor. "A little late for a visit, isn't it, Cork?" "It's not a visit, Joe." "What is it then?" She eyed his gym bag again and the box and bearskin. "I'd like to stay for a day or two." "I invited him," Rose jumped in. "His furnace is broken and he has no heat." Joe went to the cookie jar, lifted Ernie's head and took out a cookie. She leaned against the counter and considered the situation as she nibbled. "A day or two," she said. "Until Monday," Cork told her. "Art Winterbauer can't come out until Monday at the earliest." She didn't appear pleased by the prospect. "It's his house," Rose argued with a note of anger. "For goodness sake, Joe, what harm will a couple of days do?" Joe sighed and seemed to go a little limp, looking suddenly very tired. "All right," she said. "I have the guest room ready for him." Rose began to undo her apron. "I'm tired," Joe said. "It's been a long day. I'm going to bed." "Shouldn't somebody wait up for Jenny?" Cork asked. "She's been on dates before." Joe headed toward the living room. "She'll be fine." Cork picked up his things. "Guess I'm tired too." "Go on," Rose said, shooing him with her hands. "I'll lock up." Cork followed Joe upstairs. He looked in on Stevie, who lay twisted in his blankets. He carefully straightened out the bedding. The door to Anne's room was slightly ajar, and he peeked in. The reading lamp was on beside her bed. The diary of Anne Frank lay open at her side, but she was sleeping soundly. Cork put the book on the stand and switched off the light. Joe watched from the door of her bedroom. She leaned against the door jamb with her arms folded. Behind her on the bed, her briefcase lay open, files laid out on the side of the bed that used to be Cork's. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I told you, my furnace is on the blink." Joe looked skeptical. "I mean, really, what's this all about?" "Circumstances beyond my control," he shrugged. She chewed on the inside of her cheek a moment, a long-standing habit when she was considering saying something against her better judgment. This time she only said, "Don't hope for too much." "I'm not hoping for anything." He moved past her toward the guest room. Her door closed at his back. He spent a while in the bathroom tending his ribs, which had turned a sick-looking yellow. He swallowed 3 ibuprofen tablets, went to the guest room, stripped to his boxers and t-shirt, and crawled under the covers. He could hear Rose moving around in the attic room above him. That room was cozy with a brass bed, mahogany dresser and vanity, flowered curtains, and a rocker where Rose sat at night for a long time reading. She read mysteries and romance novels, and although she wouldn't admit it, kept a drawer full of National Enquirers. Cork lay in his bed listening to the squeak of her rocker as she read in the warm light of her lamp. He was tired, but couldn't sleep. He was puzzled. Too many strange things had happened that didn't seem to make sense. In the way his thinking had been conditioned to work, he was looking for connections. The judge was dead. Paul LeBeau had vanished, onto the reservation, Cork would bet, with his father. The Wendigo had called Litton's name, and someone had broken into Sam's place. On the surface, there was nothing really to connect any of these things. Still, they were extraordinary in a place like Aurora, and they'd happen within an extraordinarily short time. From what he'd seen examining the judge's body, he believed it was very possible the judge hadn't committed suicide. Whether Paul's disappearance was connected with the judge's death, he couldn't say. It was probably mere coincidence that Joe John had chosen that particular time to spirit his son away. However, coincidence was not something Cork was trained to believe in. The ransacking of his cabin? How did that fit in? And over it all loomed the presence of the Wendigo. How much stock should be put in the words of an old Anishinaabe medicine man? He thought some more about Litton, wondering why the Wendigo would call the man's name. He was a loner, a mean son of a bitch. Even so, Cork found himself feeling sorry for Harlan Litton. The picture of the man on his knees beside his dog and the terrible sound of his grieving still twisted Cork's insides. Everyone was capable of loving something, even a man like Litton who loved his dog. Now the thing Litton loved had been taken from him, and he was utterly alone. That was something Cork understood. He couldn't help turning his thinking to Molly. What was she doing now? Knitting? Reading, maybe? She was a big reader. Novels, self-discovery, things that when she talked about them seemed interesting and enlightening. She often took classes at Aurora Community College, not with any goal in mind except to learn. She was a woman curious in many ways. Cork looked out at the darkness beyond the window of the guest room. Sometimes Molly used the sauna at night, then stood outside in the cold and studied the stars while the steam rose off her skin and the chill clamped shut her pores. Was she there now, like a beautiful white ghost, naked and vaporous? Whatever she was doing, it would end with her alone in bed, like Cork, like Rose, like Joe. Finally, drowsy, Cork closed his eyes, thinking that there was something wrong with a world in which so many people slept alone. Chapter 16. Daddy! They came before Cork was really awake. He heard them scamper across the floor of the guest room, then was jolted wide awake as they leaped onto the bed, driving their knees into his kidneys. He rolled over, felt them warm and wiggly all around him. "Hey, Ann, Stevie," he grinned. He wrapped them in his arms and hugged them tightly to him. He felt a stab at his ribs where the blows had hammered him the night before, but the good feel of his children helped him ignore the pain. The kids were still in their rumpled pajamas, their teeth unbrushed, their hair stale and disheveled. Even so, they seemed like heaven to Cork. "Aunt Rose said you were here." His daughter buried her face against his t-shirt. "Are you staying?" "For a while," he said. "Christmas tree," Stevie said. "What?" "We're going to get our Christmas tree today," Anne explained. "Are you coming?" Cork rubbed Stevie's hair. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Jenny stepped into the open doorway looking tired and grumpy. "What's all the noise?" Cork lifted his head so that Jenny saw him. "Oh," she said. "What happened? Break your leg or something?" "Only my furnace." She scratched at her purple hair. "Sort of a one-night stand here?" "Sort of," Cork admitted. She shrugged and turned to leave. "We're buying a Christmas tree today," he called after her. "Ho, ho, ho," she said, her voice trailing dismally down the hall. Rose had oatmeal ready for them. On top of the steaming cereal in their bowls, Cork and Stevie and Anne made funny faces with raisins. Joe had gone to work long before Cork or the others were up. Jenny finally came down near the end of breakfast. "Oatmeal, Jen?" Rose offered. "I'll just make toast," Jenny replied sullenly. "I'm not very hungry." She took a couple of pieces of whole wheat from the bread drawer and dropped them into the toaster. She crossed her arms and waited. "After breakfast, would you be willing to take a short drive with me?" Cork asked. "Where?" "I'm going to visit a couple of hungry friends." "Some kind of Samaritan visit in keeping with the season?" "I don't think so, thanks." "Just for a little while. I'd appreciate it." "You could order me to go. You're still my father." She was watching the toaster carefully. "I don't want to do that." Rose quietly wiped dishes at the sink. Stevie and Anne had gone to the living room to watch cartoons. The toast popped up. Jenny stared at it a moment. "I suppose," she finally agreed. The drive was painfully silent. Cork tried to think exactly what it was he'd meant to say to her, but all the words seemed weak and self-pitying. Jenny stared out the window and sniffed. "A cold?" Cork finally asked. "I don't know. Probably." "How'd your date go last night?" She shrugged. "What's his name? Kubiak?" She didn't seem to think that deserved a response of any kind. "Go out with him much?" She waited a few moments, then said, "A couple of times." "Movies, huh?" She swung her gaze toward him and gave him a look that made him feel as if a door had just been slammed in his face. "Just interested," he apologized. "Yeah," she said, "sure." She looked away again, as if the all-too-familiar landscape of Aurora were far more interesting than anything her father could possibly say. But Cork kept trying. "Still planning on reading Sylvia Plath at the Christmas program?" "Why wouldn't I?" "I don't know. I thought maybe you'd talked it over with your teacher. Maybe she'd changed your mind." "She respects my judgment," Jenny said. "Good," Cork nodded, trying to generate a show of enthusiasm. "That's great." He pulled the Bronco up beside Sam's place. "What are we doing here?" She gave the Quonset hut a look of disgust. "Wait and see." The morning was bright and cold, the sunlight startling. Cork went inside and half filled the bucket with dried corn. "Going to try farming now?" Jenny asked when he came back out. "Follow me." He led the way down to the open water. The geese glided across the surface, riding their reflections in the still blue water, leaving gentle creases where they'd moved. Jenny watched them, unimpressed. "Annie's told me about these two. Dumb, if you ask me. Just asking for trouble." "Spread the grain on the ground for them." Cork pointed to the circle he'd cleared in the snow. She frowned, but did as he'd instructed, then stood expectantly watching the geese on the water. "Why don't they come? Aren't they hungry?" "They're wild. They're still more afraid of us than they are hungry. Let's step over this way." Cork led her some distance away. The geese paddled to the shore and began noisily to eat. "Why haven't they gone south?" Jenny asked. "See that one?" "The male," Jenny said. "Good." Cork was surprised she knew. His wing is injured and he can't fly. They're kind of stuck here now. She stays with him? Some geese are like that. They mate for life. I'm glad somebody does. Could we talk, Jenny? Cork finally asked. About your mom and me? What's to talk about? Jenny kicked at the snow. You're going to do what you're going to do. That's all there is to it. Not quite. She glanced at him, her eyes full of suspicion. What's that supposed to mean? I don't think I want to divorce your mom, Jen. She didn't believe him. The stone look on her face told him that. But it's not my decision alone, he explained. You mean she wants to divorce you? That's kind of how it stands. Why? What did you do? Cork watched the geese. They'd finished the grain and moved back down to the water. As they entered, they broke the reflection of the sun into 1,000 fragments. I was gone from her too long. You mean since you moved out? Before that. Long before that. You want to come back? I miss home. I don't believe you, Jenny said. She turned and started for the Bronco. I don't blame you, Cork said after her. In your shoes, I wouldn't believe me either. But Jen, I've never lied to you, at least not intentionally. She turned back angrily. You're saying Mom's responsible for the divorce? I'm not trying to turn you against her, sweetheart, really. I hurt her pretty bad, I guess, and maybe all this is exactly what I deserve. I just want you to know that if I could, I'd put it all back together. For a while, Jenny looked at the trampled snow between them, then at the geese. I thought if you loved someone, you were supposed to, forgive them. I thought that was what love was supposed to be all about. Cork shook his head. Easy to say, harder to do. So, what are you going to do? Jenny asked quietly. Cork risked moving to her. I'd like to get your mother to talk with me. Tom Griffin, Father Tom, has offered to counsel us. I'm not saying we'll succeed, but I'd like to give it a try. What do you think? She looked past him where the ice edged the open water and the signs warned of danger, and the safety stations offered the help of ropes and life rings and sturdy sleds. What could he offer her that was as substantial? I think I'd like to go now, she said. They walked back toward the Bronco. Cork saw sunlight glint off a tiny thread of a tear down her cheek. He wanted to reach out to hold her as he had when she was small, and the simplicity of Sesame Street had been her world. But he was afraid now. They walked without speaking, and they walked apart. Wait here, he told her at the Bronco. I'll be right back. He took the bucket back into the Quonset hut. The place was still a mess, but it appeared as if nothing more had been disturbed in his absence. The cardboard was still in place on the kitchen window. The furnace hadn't miraculously repaired itself. What happened? Jenny stood at the door looking shocked. Someone broke in, Cork said. Jenny took a couple of tentative steps inside. Stevie and Anne had visited Cork there before, but Jenny always found an excuse not to come. This was her first time inside Sam's place. A burglar, she asked. Nothing was taken. Why'd they break in? I think they were looking for something they didn't find. Jenny knelt and picked up a cushion from the floor. What? If I knew that, I might have a better idea who broke in. She hugged the pillow to her as she took in the spectacle of the disarray. It's scary. It is, a little. She looked at him suddenly. What if you'd been here? Maybe they wouldn't have broken in. Or maybe they would have hurt you. Remembering the warning the intruders had painfully delivered, Cork didn't want to say anything more. There was no way Jenny or any of his family was going to be involved. Come on, Cork said brusquely. Let's go. The wind rose outside, a sudden body of air that passed over the lake and into the small woods where the old foundry stood. The snow rose and swirled as it passed, as if alive. Cork froze when he heard the voice in the wind. "Dad, are you okay?" Jenny asked. He stared at her, wondering if she'd heard, but he could see she hadn't. "Let's go," he said again, trying not to show how afraid he was. But Jenny looked at him, and he saw that she knew. "What is it?" she asked, frightened. "Nothing. It's nothing, Jen." He put his arm around her and led her out into the sunlight, into the winter air that had become still again. He looked toward the trees, and as he'd expected, saw nothing unusual there. As they drove away, Cork said, "Jenny, promise me something." "What?" "Don't say anything about this to anyone. Please." "Why not?" "It's hard to explain." "Is it because you don't want anyone to know you're afraid?" That seemed as good an explanation as any, so he nodded. "I understand," Jenny said, and she smiled as if she did. Perfectly. Chapter 17. After lunch, Cork and Rose took the children and headed to the offices of Great North Development Company, where Joe had worked much of the morning with Sandy Parent. Great North was housed in the old firehouse, a block off Center Street. Built in 1897 of charcoal gray granite, the firehouse had been scheduled for demolition, but Sandy Parent and the judge had bought it and had it remodeled as a home for Great North. Before he disappeared, Joe John LeBeau had the contract to clean the Great North offices. He'd told Cork the old firehouse was haunted. He claimed that when he cleaned alone late at night, he could hear the boots of the long-dead firefighters clomping across the floor overhead. He swore that once he saw the ghost of Lars Knudsen, who'd become a local hero by giving his life trying to save the children when the old Freemason orphanage burned in '09. Joe John told Cork these things in the time when he was sober, before he walked away drunk from his truck, abandoning his family and his livelihood, a thing Cork had never understood. But a man who heard ghosts was probably a troubled man to begin with. Jenny and Rose stayed in the Bronco. Cork took Ann and Stevie into the old firehouse. Joyce Sandoval, a woman with white hair and half glasses, sat at a reception desk typing into a computer. She looked over the flat top of her glasses at Cork and the kids. "They pay you a lot for working Saturday, Joyce?" "They don't pay me a lot, period," she grumbled, but amiably. "Why aren't you out doing something with Albert?" Albert Nordberg and Joyce Sandoval had been dating for a quarter of a century. Their courtship was an institution of sorts in Aurora. Joyce took off her glasses, which were secured by a beaded cord around the back of her neck. "He says he's buying me a Christmas present. He says he doesn't want me to know what it is." She gave Cork a knowing and hopeless look. "He buys me Windsong cologne every year. I made the mistake 25 years ago of telling him it was my favorite." She glanced at Ann and winked. "Men, huh? Joyce, would you let Joe know we're here?" She lifted the receiver of her phone and pushed 3 buttons. "Cork O'Connor and a couple of L's are here for Joe." She put the receiver down. "They'll be right out. Why don't you have a seat?" Joyce Sandoval went back to working on her computer. Behind the reception desk, the area of the firehouse where the big engine had parked was occupied now by a dozen workspaces, all currently empty. Cork and the children sat on a brown leather sofa in a small waiting area. While they waited, Cork entertained them with ghost stories he'd heard from Joe John LeBeau. By the time the elevator doors opened and Joe and Sandy Parent stepped out, Stevie's eyes were huge with amazement. Cork rose and offered his hand in greeting. "Sandy," he said. "Cork." Sandy gave the children a warm smile. "Hi, kids." "Hello, Mr. Parent," Ann said politely. "Please, it's Sandy," Parent said. "Mr. Parent," Ann began. Sandy, when you go to Washington, will you meet the president?" "I already have, honey," he said. "He's a very nice man." Stevie picked his nose and looked unimpressed. He was watching the ceiling carefully. "How's it going?" Cork asked Joe. "Like a three-legged horse," Parent replied for her. Joe zipped the briefcase she carried. "Bob's death complicates Sandy's transition to Washington in a lot of ways." "Joe tells me you've got a furnace on the blink, Cork," Parent said, moving abruptly away from the subject of his father's death. "I've got a good man who does a lot of work for Great North. I'd be glad to send him out." "Thanks, Sandy, but Art Winterbauer is coming on Monday. I'll be fine until then." Stevie stopped picking his nose and asked suddenly, "Is it really haunted?" "Haunted?" Joe looked annoyed. "Who told you that?" "Daddy?" "I was telling him some of the stories Joe John used to tell me about the things he saw in this place," Cork explained. "I hate to disappoint you, Stevie," Sandy Parent smiled, "but I wouldn't put a lot of stock in the stories of a man like Joe John LeBeau. He'd probably been drinking when he saw those things." "I think we should be going," Joe said. "Sandy's busy." Parent wished them good luck finding a tree and saw them to the door. "Cork, if you change your mind about that furnace, just let me know." "I've got the situation under control." "Sure," Parent said. He watched them until they were all in the Bronco, then he stepped back into the old firehouse. "He's nice," Ann said. "Do you think so?" Joe asked. "And he's met the president," Ann said. "The president puts his pants on one leg at a time like every other man," Jenny said, dourly unimpressed. Stevie looked down at his own pants, confused. "I'd do 'em both together." The St. Agnes Boy Scouts had been given a corner of the Super Value parking lot to sell their Christmas trees. Cork's family spread out and called out their finds to one another. Finally, they settled on a big white pine with needles soft as cat fur. Cork hauled it to the trailer to pay, and Arnie Bjorkson, the scoutmaster, asked if he wanted a new cut on the trunk. Just at that moment, Cork caught sight of Darla LeBeau coming out of the supermarket with a cart full of groceries. "Go ahead," he said to Arnie. "I'll be right back." He jogged away. "Darla?" he called after her. She was clearly not excited to see him. "What do you want?" she asked as she unloaded the sacks into her station wagon. "I just wanted to ask about Paul." He wheezed, trying to catch his breath, swearing silently to quit smoking. "And Joe John. I'm worried." "I'm Paul's mother and Joe John's wife. I'll worry." She shoved a sack onto the back seat, pushed the cart away fiercely, and slid into the driver's seat. "Is something wrong, Darla?" Cork put a hand on her arm. "Is Paul in any danger?" "I have to go," she said. She pulled her arm away and closed the door. Cork leaned his face close to the window so that when he spoke his breath fogged the glass. "I'm Joe John's friend. I only want to help." She was intent on jamming the key into the ignition and didn't answer. She started the engine. Her tires spit snow and gravel as she drove away. Cork stared after her and thought about some of the items he'd seen in the grocery sacks. Cheerios, Pop-Tarts, peanut butter, Fig Newtons, potato chips, Slim Jims. It was possible Darla LeBeau ate these things, but Cork thought they would appeal a great deal more to a hungry teenager. They moved the sofa into the living room and set the tree in front of the big window that faced the street. Cork hauled the boxes of Christmas decorations up from the basement. Stevie helped him check the lights while Rose and Ann and Jenny put hooks on all the bulbs. Joe sorted through the albums in the record cabinet and pulled out Christmas music and put it on to play. For a long time, Cork had felt lost, but there was something about the tradition of decorating the tree that brought him home. When he unpacked the small box that held the last of the delicate blue bulbs from the first Christmas after he and Joe were married, Joe smiled, and it made him happy. Together they placed the bulbs on the tree, then the children tossed on the icicles. When it was done, they plugged in the lights and stepped back, and all of them were silent. The bulbs blinked and the tinsel and garlands sparkled, and although it was very much like every tree they'd ever had, this one felt special. Cork moved close to Joe and took a chance. He put his arm about her waist. She seemed a little startled, but didn't stop him. Rose began to sing along with Andy Williams on the stereo, lending her fine soprano to Joy to the World. Pretty soon they all joined in. It felt like old times, almost as if nothing had ever happened to shatter their happiness. The telephone rang. Rose answered. "It's for you, Cork," she said. Cork took the phone. "Yes?" He nodded and said, "Uh-huh," a couple of times. Then, "Your office?" He glanced into the living room, where the others had begun to pack up the ornament boxes. "I'll be there," he promised and hung up. He went back to the living room. "I have to go." "Will you be back for dinner?" Rose asked. "I'll call and let you know." "Do you have to go?" Anne moaned. Cork put his hand on her red hair. "It's important." He looked once more at the tree. "It's sure a beauty." Anne smiled and said, "It's the best." Wally Shawno sat at the desk Cork had occupied for 7 years. Cork hadn't set foot in the jail since he'd left office, and he felt strange walking into this room that had been so much a part of his own life, and finding another man so comfortable in his place. Cork had hung framed prints on the walls, Matisse and Renoir, reproductions of paintings he'd seen and appreciated in the Art Institute in Chicago. He liked to think that the law and the rest of a civilized society were integrated. Shawno had removed the paintings and put up photographs of himself in a boat and on a pier, proudly holding up big muskies. Among the items on the 3-shelved bookcase behind Shawno was a simple black Bible. Cork could see from the tattered corners of the cover that it was often read. The end of a slender fabric bookmark, forked like a serpent's tongue, jutted from the pages near the middle. "Thanks for coming, Cork," Shawno said. He waved toward the chair on the other side of his desk. "Have a seat." Cork sat down. Shawno held a rubber band in his hands and played with it while he talked. "I heard you were home. That's why I called there." "What was so important?" Cork asked. "Sigurd called me. He said you'd had a look at the judge's body." "Why?" "Curiosity." Cork sat back and watched Shawno's fingers fidget with the rubber band. "Was your curiosity satisfied?" "I wouldn't say that, no." Shawno dropped the rubber band. He got up and went to a big metal thermos sitting on the windowsill. "Coffee?" he asked. Cork declined. He watched Shawno pour steaming coffee into the thermos cup. It was like Shawno, that big thermos. In his suspenders and khakis, he looked just like the kind of man who'd carry a lunch bucket to work. Shawno took a big gulp of coffee and his throat drew taut against the heat. "Tell me about it," he said. "Sigurd does a fine job of making a corpse look good for an open casket, but he doesn't know squat about forensic medicine." "Why should he?" Shawno drank some more coffee and waited. "Dorsal lividity," Cork explained. "Blood settled along the back of the judge's body after he died. Back of his arms and legs, buttocks. Nothing in front along the ribs, stomach, pelvis. He'd been lying on his back quite a while, but I found him on his stomach." "You point this out to Sigurd?" Sigurd wouldn't have cared. Much simpler for him and everybody if the judge killed himself, and that's that. "Why didn't you call me?" "Because the truth is, I wouldn't care much either, except for what it might mean about the boy." Shawno traded his coffee cup for the rubber band. He toyed with the band for a while. "What does it mean?" "I'm not sure. Maybe Paul saw something he shouldn't have. Maybe something that scared him. In any case, I think it sent him into hiding." "He's not hiding. He's with Joe John." "Where?" "If I had to make a guess, I'd say somewhere on the reservation. I sent a man out yesterday to talk to Joe John's sister, Wanda Manydeeds. She wouldn't say boo." Shawno lifted his thermos as if to pour himself some more coffee, but he paused and said, "Look, if you're so worried about Paul LeBeau, why don't you have a talk with Wanda? Maybe you can get more out of her than my man could. I'd just as soon be sure about the boy." "What makes you think she'll talk to me?" "Your blood," Shawno said honestly. "You've got a little Ojibwe running through you." That and the fact you don't wear a badge anymore. What do you say? All right. And maybe you should have a look at the judge's body while I'm out there. A pinched look crossed Shawno's face, as if his underwear had suddenly shrunk a couple of sizes. Can't. Why not? Sigurd already cremated it. Listen, Cork, next time you think you found something, don't wait to tell me, okay? It was his grandmother Dilsey, who had never been farther from Aurora and the Iron Lake Reservation than the Twin Cities, who had told him the story of how the Anishinaabe came to be a Great Lakes people. Long ago, the first people, for this is what the word Anishinaabe meant, had lived on the shores of the Great Salt Water far to the east. They were happy there, hunting and fishing and living in peace with their brothers. Gitche Manitou was good to them and showed his favor by lifting the megas, a giant seashell above the water. The rays of the sun reflected off the shiny surface of the shell, giving the Anishinaabe light and health and wisdom. But one day the shell sank beneath the salt water and a darkness came over the first people. Sickness and death moved among them like hungry animals, and they lived in fear. The Megas rose up again far to the west out of a great river at a place called Moneong, Montreal, where the first people built new wigwams and for a long time lived again in the light and warmth of the Megas. 3 more times the Megas disappeared from sight. 3 more times it rose up, each time farther west. First on the shore of the great lake called Huron. Next at Boating, Sault Ste. Marie, where the water empties out of Lake Superior. The last time the Megas rose, it was at Moningwunakoning, La Pointe Island, where its rays reflected sunlight to even the farthest Anishinaabe villages, blessing them with light, life, and wisdom. Grandma Dilsey told him a lot of stories, but it wasn't until he took a course in Ojibwe history and culture offered by the fledgling American Indian Studies Department at the University of Minnesota that he learned facts. He was surprised to discover that the Anishinaabe were the largest Native American tribe north of Mexico. They had indeed migrated long ago from the Atlantic coastline, but the death that had descended upon them and forced them west wasn't magic. It was war with the Iroquois nation. The war was old and the hostilities deep. The origin of the word Ojibwe meant to roast until puckered, for this was the fate that often befell captured enemies. He learned much about the history of his grandmother's people, including the insidious treaties that had attempted to divide and disenfranchise them. Since their battles with the Iroquois and later the Dakota, the first people had battled corruption in the BIA, poverty, alcoholism, the cruelty of government schools, and continued attempts by even well-meaning whites to eradicate their culture and their language. The Anishinaabe had survived, and solid populations were spread across Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Canada. But most of Cork's heritage was white, and in his way of living he'd chosen the white man's world. With his reddish hair and fair skin, he looked more Irish than he ever would Ojibwe. And life was difficult enough as it was. To live it as Indian would have made it that much harder. He headed out to the Iron Lake Reservation in the late afternoon, still buoyed by the warmth of spirit decorating the Christmas tree had given him. The sun was low, nestled into the bare branches of the trees like a fat red rooster. Iron Lake was not a large reservation. It comprised less than 400 square miles of woods, lakes, and bogs, with its small population of Anishinaabe living in the 2 villages of Alouette and Brandywine, and in small, isolated houses or shacks or trailers scattered throughout the woods. Except for State Highway 37, which cut through the reservation in a northwest-southeast line, the roads on the reservation were all bumpy, rutted gravel or dirt. Most winters, the back roads were impassable for long periods. But as Cork turned off the highway at the gathering of HUD houses and the old government center that was Alouette and headed into the woods toward Nokomis House, He found the snow cleanly plowed right down to the washboard surface of the road. The casino, he knew. The Chippewa Grand Casino, owned and operated by the Iron Lake Band of Ojibwe, had opened its doors only 6 months earlier, but already the revenue from the slots and blackjack tables and keno and mega bingo had surpassed even the most optimistic projections. In those months alone, the casino had reported a gross income of almost $6 million. The gamblers came by busloads from Milwaukee, Chicago, the Twin Cities, Winnipeg, and even as far as Kansas City on special junkets arranged by travel agencies. Or they drove in from small cities and towns and farms for a taste of Vegas in their own backyard. The gambling had paid off big for the Anishinaabe of the reservation. Every household belonging to the Iron Lake Band of Ojibwe received a monthly allotment of several $1,000s from the casino profits. Any Native American wanting a job could find work at the casino. New road maintenance equipment had been purchased. There were plans for paving, for a new tribal council building, and for a school. Cork thought it was no wonder that the Dakota who ran casinos in southern Minnesota called gambling the New Buffalo. 4 miles out of Alouette, still on the washboard gravel road, Cork approached Mission Center. It was only a small clearing with a single square one-story building in the middle. The Catholic mission that had once served the reservation had been abandoned for more than a decade before Father Tom Griffin arrived in Aurora and set out almost single-handedly to bring it back to life. He spent a good deal of his free time there, refurbishing the old structure. Although the priest tried to enlist the parishioners of St. Agnes, white and red, Cork had heard that more often than not, St. Kawasaki worked alone. By the time Cork reached Mission Center, the sun had set. Stars were emerging from the amethyst sky of the east. A planet like a small ember glowed above the trees. Mars, the angry god of another religion. Cork was surprised to see smoke rising from the stovepipe on the mission roof, although there were no lights visible inside. He stopped and got out. The woods of birch and pine that pressed themselves against the clearing had grown dark. The evening light turned the snow a soft blue, and everything was still except for a slight wind that came out of the trees and across the snow, passing Cork with an icy whisper. He turned his collar up. The front door was locked. He peered in at a window. The first thing Father Tom Griffin had done in refurbishing the old mission was to replace the windows and put up shades, which were now drawn. Cork waded around to the back of the building. Behind the mission was a cemetery that, unlike the mission, had never been abandoned. It was marked by a black wrought iron fence waist-high. The Catholics on the reservation had continued to use the cemetery to bury their dead, including, most recently, Vernon Blackwater, who'd passed away from cancer less than a week before. Many of the Anishinaabe buried in the cemetery had chosen traditional burial houses, small shelters of wood covering the graves. Most of the others were memorialized with a simple stone or a white cross. From what Cork understood, Vernon Blackwater had both. With his feet pointed west along Chebacuna, the path of souls, he'd been laid to rest in a grave house marked also by a tall granite cross. It was just like Blackwater to cover all his bases that way. During his illness, he'd been treated not only by the white man's medicines, but also with the charms and the healing songs of Wanda Menedides. In the end, as he lay on his deathbed, Blackwater had requested both the priest, Father Tom Griffin, and Wanda Menedides to be present, one to give him extreme unction, the other to sing him along the path to the land of souls. Parked near the cemetery gate was St. Kawasaki's old snowmobile, the machine he called Lazarus. The snow behind the mission was stained with black oil spots where Lazarus had leaked. Beside the snowmobile, leaning against the wrought iron fence around the cemetery, was the priest's motorcycle. As Cork came around the rear corner of the building, the back door opened and St. Kawasaki stepped outside. He was wearing his leather jacket and red masked stocking cap. He didn't see Cork as he fumbled with the lock. "Hey, Tom," Cork called. St. Kawasaki spun. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he cried hoarsely. He pulled off his stocking cap and mask. His good eyes still looked startled. "You scared the piss out of me." "Sorry, Tom. What are you doing here?" "I'm on my way to see Wanda Manydeeds. I want to talk to her about Joe, John, and Paul." The priest scratched his cheek. Cork could hear the scrape of Tom Griffin's fingernails across the grizzle of his 5 o'clock shadow. "If you think you can get anything out of her, I'd like to hear what she has to say. Mind if I come along?" "Fine by me. Why don't you come in the Bronco? You can pick up your motorcycle on the way back." "Sounds good," the priest agreed. "No luck with Lazarus over there?" The priest grinned and shook his head hopelessly. "I believe this time it's going to take a real miracle to get it running again." Chapter 18. Like most reservations in Minnesota, the Iron Lake Reservation was a crazy quilt of landholdings. Land held in trust by the tribe, land allotted to tribal members, land that had been sold or leased to non-Indians for such purposes as lumbering and recreation, and land belonging to the county or state or Forest Service were all patched together within reservation boundaries. Nokomis House stood on land that at one time had been leased out, but had long since reverted to the tribal trust. Large, rustic, and isolated, it had been an old hunting lodge, unused for many years before Wanda Manydeeds turned it into a shelter for Native American women. The lodge stood at the edge of a small lake called 5 Pines because 5 massive white pines, each 10 feet in circumference, stood together along the shoreline near the building. How they'd been missed in the early logging that cleared the area of the great giants long before the turn of the century, Cork didn't know, but there they stood, watching over Nokomis House like a cadre of mute, powerful guardians. As he drove up, Cork saw Wanda Manydeeds at work in the turnaround that had been plowed beside the lodge. She held a chainsaw and was cutting wood. She wore jeans, hiking boots, and a red down vest over a blue denim shirt. Her son, Amek, a small boy bundled heavily in a wool-lined jean jacket, sat on a stump watching. A yellow Alice Chalmers bulldozer sat idle and snow-covered beside the turnaround. Behind the bulldozer, a 1/4 acre of trees had been raised, and the ragged ends of uprooted stumps jutted through the snow like the claws of great beasts thrust up from the frozen ground. Even with the soft snow blanketing it all, the scene had a desolate, destroyed look about it. As he parked the Bronco and stepped out, Cork smelled the chainsaw's oily exhaust hanging in the air. Wanda Manydeeds put down the saw and watched, expressionless, as the 2 men came toward her. "Evening, Wanda," Cork said. The woman tilted her head slightly in a silent greeting. St. Kawasaki knelt down and, in the language of the Ojibwe, greeted the boy on the stump. "Anin, Amek." The boy smiled shyly. "Anin, father," he answered quietly. "What's going on back there?" Cork asked, indicating the area of the raised trees. "Expansion," Wanda Manydeeds said. "Everything gets bigger now, courtesy of the casino." "Don't plan on touching the pines, do you?" "The pines will be here long after you and I are gone. What do you want?" "Just to talk a while, if I could." "About what?" Before Cork could answer, the door of Nokomis House opened and a young woman stepped out. "Amek, undas," she called to the boy. "Come here." The boy looked at his mother. Wanda nodded and Amek slipped off the stump and ran to the old lodge. The young woman put her arm protectively around Amek, looked suspiciously at Cork, and ushered the boy inside. "About your brother," Cork finally replied. "I want to talk about Joe John." "There's nothing to talk about." "I heard he's back." "I heard that too. Please don't smoke. It's a rule at Nokomis House." Cork knelt and extinguished his cigarette in the snow. The door to Nokomis House opened again, and a gray-haired woman whom Cork recognized as Tilly Favre, Wanda Manydeeds' aunt, poked her head outside. From within the old lodge came the sound of a baby's incessant crying. "Makwa," Tilly Favre called to Wanda. "He's hungry." Wanda Manydeeds eyed her guests unhappily, but she said, "Come inside." There was a sitting room just inside the door. A young girl, perhaps 12, sat on a green sofa with a baby in her arms. As soon as Wanda had hung up her down vest, the girl handed her the baby. "Miigwech, Susan," Wanda Manydeeds said. Although the baby was red-faced, squirming and crying, the girl seemed sorry to have to give him up. She lingered a moment as if hoping Wanda would return him to her. As soon as the baby was in his mother's arms, he stopped crying. Wanda nodded toward the doorway, and the girl drifted away. Although Wanda didn't invite him past the sitting room, Cork knew beyond it was a large common room with a huge stone fireplace. The lodge smelled of burning pine, and every once in a while the pop of sap from the next room told Cork there was a good fire going. The second floor of the lodge held bedrooms. Above him, Cork could hear the old boards squeak, shifting under the weight of unseen guests in their wanderings. Wanda Manydeeds was a tall, stolid woman in her mid-40s, with long black hair parted in the middle so that it lay against her head like the folded wings of a raven. On one wrist was an ornate beaded bracelet, and beaded earrings swung from her earlobes. As a much younger woman, she'd been part of the takeover of the BIA office in Minneapolis and had been arrested and briefly jailed. More recently, she'd been elected as a member of the tribal council. She had 2 children and no husband. The boy, Amek, Ojibwe for beaver, was 6. His father, Warren Manydeeds, had been killed in a logging accident just 2 weeks before Amek was born. Wanda Manydeeds had never remarried. The infant, Makwa, was only 4 months old, and Wanda had never said a word about the father. Because the priest and Wanda Manydeeds worked closely together, the worst of the rumor mill in Aurora had it that Father Tom Griffin was responsible. Cork didn't believe it for an instant. In their 2 cultures, they were the guides along the path of upright living, and Cork had never known 2 people more dedicated to their callings. Wanda walked to a cane rocker, sat down, and began to rock the squirming baby. "How is the burger business?" she asked. "In winter, closed," Cork said. "It smells good in here. Bear." "Yes." The baby began to whimper. "Where'd you get bear meat?" She looked at him as if the question were stupid. "I shot a bear." "I didn't know you hunted." "There are lots of things about me you don't know. Why should you? You never lived on the reservation." The girl who'd held the baby peeked through the doorway. Wanda Manydeeds glanced at her. "Susan, go watch television for a little while." The girl frowned, but did as she was told. "Her mother's in the rehab center on the Red Lake Res," Wanda explained. "Susan wants a baby. Someone to love her. She'll make a good mother if I can get her to wait until she's 20 and married." She shifted the fussing baby to her shoulder and patted his back. "You didn't come here to talk about hunting bears. You want to know the same thing the sheriff's man wanted to know. You want to know where Joe John is." "Yes," Cork said. "And I'm supposed to tell you? Because you have a little of the people's blood flowing through you? Why do you even care? You're not the sheriff anymore." "Joe John's my friend." "Then leave him be." The baby began to cry in earnest again. Wanda Manydeeds undid the top buttons of her denim blouse, unsnapped her feeding bra. The upper slope of her breast bore an elaborate tattoo that Cork easily recognized as the wisdom tree. The wisdom tree was an ancient, isolated white cedar, normally a swamp tree, that grew on the very tip of a point of rocky land jutting into Lake Superior. The whites called it the witch tree because it grew out of solid rock and had no visible means of sustenance. It was said to be as old as the people themselves and was sacred. Like Henry Malou, Wanda Manydeeds was of the Cormorant clan, the clan of teachers, and the Medewawin. The baby's mouth clasped Wanda's nipple greedily just below the roots of the tree, and the baby settled into quiet sucking. "Have you seen Joe John?" Cork asked. "No." "Is he back?" "He's around." "Here on the reservation?" "In Tamarack County." "Do you know where?" Wanda's nipple slipped from the baby's lips. The baby whimpered, and she guided the searching mouth back. "He has Paul?" She considered a moment before answering. "Paul's safe." "Why are they hiding?" "Why does anyone hide?" "What's Darla afraid of?" Cork pressed. "What's everybody so afraid of? Why won't anyone talk?" She looked at him, and her almond eyes were hard with contempt. "You look at my silence and Darla's with a man's perception. You believe silence comes only from fear. Silence often comes from strength and from wisdom." She looked down at the baby. "That's all I have to say to you." The priest, who until that moment had been silent himself, said respectfully, "Thank you, Wanda." "You're welcome, Tom," she replied without looking up. The priest turned to leave. Cork stood still and asked, "Did Joe John have anything to do with the judge's murder?" Wanda stopped rocking. She glanced up from the baby. Wisdom may have been the reason for her silence, but Cork knew fear was certainly the cause of the look on her face. "Get out," she said. "Come on, Cork." The priest put his hand on Cork's shoulder. Cork said to the woman, "I only want to help." "Stay out of this then," she said. "The best thing you can do is just to stay the hell out of this." The baby began to cry, a rolling wail. Wanda closed up her blouse and stood up, cradling the baby against her. "Shh, Makwa, shh." Tilly Favre appeared, and two other women and the girl. They all shared the same hostile look as they stared at Cork. "Miigwech, Wanda," he said. "Thanks." He turned and left. Outside, Cork took one last look at the torn forest next to the lodge. The uprooted trees made him anxious in an inexplicable way. The money from the casino was changing everything, changing it fast and changing it forever. And who could say what change was for the best and what was not? In the Bronco, the priest said, "What the hell was that about the judge being murdered?" "I think he may have been," Cork said. Night had set in fully, and as Cork negotiated the winding road back to the mission, the high beam of his headlights blasted the woods with glare and shadow. "Murder," the priest said quietly. "And somehow that boy and his father are involved." "Do you think Wanda is telling the truth?" "Yes," Cork said as the mission clearing came into sight. "But she's not telling everything she knows." Rose was at the kitchen table, wrapping presents. She seemed startled when Cork shoved open the back door and stepped in. "Sorry, Rose," he said. "Didn't mean to scare you." He hung up his coat. "Where is everybody?" "They went Christmas shopping." Cork headed to the cookie jar on the counter, lifted Ernie's head, and took out 2 chocolate chip cookies. He watched Rose, who was intent on making a bow out of a length of gold ribbon. She glanced up at him, seemed about to speak, then looked back down at her ribbon. "What is it?" Cork asked. "Nothing." "Go on." "It's probably just my imagination." "What?" She put the ribbon down. "I think someone's been in the house." Cork had been leaning against the kitchen counter. He stood up straight. "Why do you think that?" Rose looked a little uncertain. "It's kind of hard to explain. It's the little things. Like this afternoon, I went to the linen closet for a clean towel. I always put the towels and washcloths in order. Dark blue on the bottom, light blue in the middle, white on top. They were out of order." "One of the kids," Cork suggested, "probably looking for hidden Christmas presents." "Maybe," Rose said. "Anything else?" "I took some clothes into Joe's room. Her bed was neatly made, but the corner of the spread was up, as if it had been lifted so that someone could look under." Maybe she just did a lousy job of making her bed this morning. You know how neat Joe is. Again, it could be kids looking for Christmas presents. Rose looked unconvinced. There are other things, all small like that. But it gives me the strangest feeling and I can't shake it. Has anything been taken? Not that I can tell, and I've looked pretty thoroughly. When would someone have come in? The only time I can think of is when we were out shopping for the tree. Did you lock the door? This is Aurora, Cork. I never lock the door except at night. The house was dead still. The refrigerator motor clicked on with a deep, startling hum. Rose jerked in her chair. I'm sure it's nothing, Rose, Cork said. But let's start locking the doors just to be sure. He locked the back door. I'm going upstairs to clean up a little. You okay? Yes, Rose smiled. I'm sure, like you say, it's nothing. She went back to work on her bow. Cork locked the front door on his way upstairs. He checked the guest room, Annie's and Jenny's and Stevie's rooms, and finally Joe's. He stood in his wife's bedroom where on the surface everything looked fine. When he'd lived in the house, he'd had an intimate knowledge of how things should feel. But he'd been gone for months, and he'd lost that feel. Now he stood there, a stranger. Still, he trusted Rose. First Sam's place had been violated, then the house on Gooseberry Lane. Were they looking for something here too? Or was this just another warning, a subtle indication that his family wasn't safe either? If they were looking for something, what the hell could it be? And why did they think he had it? He went to the basement, took the rolled bearskin from a locked black trunk near the furnace and brought it to his room. The skin had been left to him by Sam Winter Moon in his will. It had come from the biggest black bear Cork had ever seen, the one he'd hunted with Sam when he was 14. Cork undid the ropes. As he rolled out the skin, he uncovered the box he'd put there over a year ago. It was the size of a large dictionary and nearly as heavy. He lifted the lid. Inside was a Smith & Wesson .38 police special, a belt and holster, and a box of cartridges. He'd put them away after he'd killed Arnold Stanley. He'd believed he would never use them again, but like so much about his life, it appeared he might be wrong. He was tired, so tired he could barely lift his feet to keep walking. The pack on his back felt so heavy he could hardly carry it. Sam Winter Moon moved ahead of him silently, the Winchester held ready in his hands. They were in an unfamiliar part of the forest, an area torn and desolate. The trees had been razed, the stumps ripped from the ground. Their roots had become claws thrust toward the evening sky. The sun was low and red, and everything in the forest was tinted with an angry hue. Sam Winter Moon had said the bear was near, very near. They had to be careful now. Sam moved lightly on the balls of his feet and made no sound. Every step for Cork was labored and broke the silence with a terrible crunching of dry autumn leaves. They came to the middle of the desolate ground, to a place where stumps and logs and branches had been piled in a heap, the way loggers would leave a mess for burning. The area was full of thistle grown chest high, and autumn sumac with leaves gone blood red along the branches. Sam looked the pile over carefully. In the evening light, it looked like something humped and dying. Sam Winter Moon chambered around. He lifted his hand in a sign for Cork to wait, and began to circle the huge pile of debris. In a moment he was lost among the tall thistle and sumac. Cork's heart beat so hard and fast it shook his whole body. The sound of it got louder and louder, so that Cork was sure the noise would startle the bear. He tried to breathe out the fear. He wanted to call to Sam, call him back from the danger, but Sam Winter Moon was already gone, already lost to him. Then the pile began to stir. The jagged stumps and timber rose up, forming themselves into the great bear standing on its hind legs. It rose above Cork and splayed its claws, long and sharp and white, against the red of the sky. The bear lifted its black muzzle, and a deafening roar exploded from its maw. As Cork watched terrified, it came for him. He gripped the bow in his hands, a bow that had not been there before, and he reached toward his back, toward the quiver that hung where the pack had been. His hands trembled as he drew out an arrow and tried to think where best to shoot for a kill. He glanced at the bowstring and quickly fitted the arrow. When he looked up, the bear had changed. It wasn't the great black animal anymore, but a huge ogre, the Wendigo, man-shaped with its skin bloodied and its teeth stained from feeding. Cork raised the bow and sighted on the creature's chest where the heart would be if the Wendigo had a heart. But the bow was no longer a bow. It was a .38 police special, and as he pulled the trigger, the Wendigo was no longer an ogre, but was little Arnold Stanley with wet hair and a hopeless look on his face as his chest exploded with splashes of red. "Cork, are you all right?" It was Joe in the doorway. "You cried out." Cork sat up in bed, his heart still racing. "Yes," he said. He breathed deeply, rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. "Just a dream." He pulled off the covers and swung his feet off the bed. He reached to the nightstand for a cigarette. A bit of light came through his window, the reflection of the street lamp off the snow outside, but his room was mostly dark. Jo came in, not far. She wore a flannel nightgown and held her arms across her chest as if she were cold. "Want to talk about it?" "No." He struck a match, lit his cigarette, sighed out a cloud of smoke. "It was just a dream, and it's over." He could smell her, the scent of the oil of Olay she used at night to soften her skin. "Putting up the tree today was nice," he said after a while. "Yes," she answered. "I'm amazed the blue bulbs have lasted this long," he said. "We've been careful. About the bulbs, at least." She might have smiled. It was hard to see her face clearly. "I'm going back to bed." "You're cold?" he asked to keep her there. "Freezing." "You were always too cold, and I was always too warm. You used to pull the blankets off me, remember?" He heard her take a deep breath. "Good night, Cork." She turned and left. He finished his cigarette, and then he tried to sleep.
This ends Disc 4. Iron Lake, Disc 5.
Chapter 19. The next morning, after Jo and Rose had taken the children to church, Cork drove to Molly's place. She didn't answer his knock. He checked the shed where she kept her old Saab, and found the car still there. He glanced at the sauna by the lake. No smoke from the stovepipe. Ski tracks headed down to the lake, but he couldn't tell how recently they'd been made. He went back to the house and let himself in with the key she hung on a nail under the back steps. She usually kept her skis on a rack on the back porch, but the rack was empty. Cork stepped into the kitchen, took off his hat and gloves and coat, and began to make himself coffee from the can of Hills Brothers Molly kept on hand just for him. He loved Molly's kitchen. There was always a certain disorder to it that made it feel comfortable. She wasn't slovenly, but she often left a book open on the table, a few dishes sitting by the sink, or her knitting bag sagged on the floor next to a chair. Molly lived in her kitchen, and her spirit filled it, so that just standing there, Cork breathed her in. If he'd believed in prayer, he would have prayed at that moment for a way around what was ahead. He bent over the sink, feeling weak and sick to his stomach, shaking as if he had a fever. At least he hadn't told Molly he loved her. Maybe that was a small blessing, something spared them both. The only woman he'd ever been sure he loved and had told so was Jo, and that hadn't exactly turned out well. Was it always that way with love? He poured himself a cup of coffee, and as he took his first sip, Molly came off the lake and removed her skis. He watched her disappear into the sauna. Smoke began to rise from the stovepipe. She reappeared with a long metal bar with a chiseled end, an ice spud, went 10 feet out onto the ice and began vigorously thrusting the bar downward. It looked as if the heavy metal was going right through the thick ice, but Cork knew there was a hole there Molly would use to plunge into after her sauna. She was simply clearing the thin layer of surface ice that had formed since she'd last taken a dip. When she and Cork did the sauna together, she usually consented to a brief roll in the snow or to just standing in the cold for a time while the icy air cooled them. She did this for Cork, who thought a plunge into the lake in the middle of winter was taking an experience a step too far. She put the ice spud away, took her skis and poles in hand, and started toward the house. When she saw Cork's Bronco, a big smile spread across her pretty face. "There is a God," she said, sweeping into the kitchen, her cheeks flushed, her clothes carrying the cold that Cork could feel across the room. She pulled off her down jacket and hung it on a wall peg next to Cork's coat. She wore a red sweater that she also pulled off, and under it a white thermal top that hugged her breasts and her flat belly. Her cheeks were deep pink and her eyes full of excitement. "I was out on that gorgeous lake thinking what a treat it would be to come back and sauna with you." She crossed to him exuberantly and kissed him. She stepped back. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "That's not true." She studied him so carefully that Cork had to look away. He cupped his coffee tightly with both hands. "We've got to talk." "You never talk. It must be bad." "Let's sit down." "I'm okay." She stared at him, and a cold, knowing look seemed to come into her eyes. "Molly, I've been doing a lot of thinking about us." "What about us?" Cork looked at his coffee. He could see his eyes reflected on the dark surface. They looked worried. "You've been wonderful, Molly. You've been better than I deserved." "Don't feed me a lot of crap, Cork. What is it? What's going on?" "I want to try to put my marriage back together." "So that's it." She turned away and went to the stove. She took the tea kettle, filled it with water, set it on a burner, and turned on the gas flame. "She asked you back?" "Not exactly." "This is your idea, then?" He stepped nearer. "Molly, it's not about you. You've been wonderful." "Right." "The truth is, it's the children. I don't want my kids to hurt anymore. Can you understand? I have a history in that house on Gooseberry Lane. Maybe it's already too late, but I don't want to let go if there's a chance of saving it." She touched her forehead a moment, as if thinking deeply. "So you'll be moving back in?" "I already have, in a way. I'm staying there now while my furnace gets fixed." She faced him, and all the freshness that had colored her face when she first came in was gone. "Next you'll tell me you're sleeping with her." "I want to put my life back together. For better or worse, Joe's part of that." Molly's eyes narrowed on him for a moment. Then she pulled away and went to the cupboard. She grabbed a mug and swung back toward him. "What do you expect from me? A blessing? Or maybe you think if things don't work out, I'll just throw the door open and you can waltz back in here." "Well, you can't, Cork." She tugged at the lid of a canister that held tea. The lid flew off and hit the floor with a tinny clatter. She just stood for a moment, staring at the lid on the floor. "I'm sorry, Molly." She shoved the canister back on the countertop. To hell with the tea. She reached up into the cupboard and took down a bottle of Jack Daniels. "You don't drink," Cork told her. "I do on special occasions." She poured liquor into the mug and drank it down. "What are you waiting for? You said what you had to." "I'm just wondering what you ever saw in me anyway. I'm a decade older than you, getting heavy, going bald, I smoke." "Whatever I thought I saw, I guess I was wrong. It doesn't matter now anyway." The tea kettle began to whistle. Molly made no move to take it off the flame. Cork left. Outside, he could still hear the cry of the tea kettle growing thinner and thinner. as he walked away. After Cork had gone, Molly went down to the sauna. In the changing room, she took off her clothes and laid them neatly folded on the wooden bench. She stepped into the sauna itself, sat down in the darkened room, and let the heat draw out of her the anger and the hurt. She'd almost told him she loved him. So many times she'd been on the edge of letting the words spill out, but her past had kept her cautious, and now she was glad, very glad, she hadn't. Let him go back to a woman who didn't care. Molly didn't care either. What ran down her cheeks and tasted of salt wasn't tears, but good, cleansing sweat. It poured from every part of her body. When she finally stood and ran outside, she trailed steam like a thing that had been through fire. As she dropped into the hole she'd cleared of ice, the bitterly cold water of the lake squeezed her hard, wrung her out, and left her wonderfully empty. Chapter 20. After church, Jenny and Anne went with Cork to Sam's place. While he retrieved his dark suit, the girls spread out the corn for Romeo and Juliet. "What's that for?" Anne asked when they got back into the Bronco. "It's what I dress in to say nice things about a bad man." "Are you going with Mom to the memorial service for Judge Parrott?" "I am." "You didn't even like him," Jenny pointed out. "I like him better now," Cork said. Jenny smiled, then actually laughed. At home, Cork put on his suit. While he was slipping on his tie, Anne knocked and came in. She sat on his bed and ran her hands over the bearskin. "Where'd this come from?" "It belonged to Sam Wintermoon. He left it to me." "Is it a bearskin?" "Bingo." Cork leaned near the dresser mirror, took the two ends of his tie in hand, and worked on a Windsor knot. "Why'd he leave it to you?" "He knew it would mean a lot to me." "What does it mean to you?" Cork finished the knot. He sat beside Anne, took the bearskin, and laid it across both their laps. The skin was large and spilled onto the floor. "It came from the biggest black bear I ever saw. Biggest Sam ever saw, too, and he'd seen plenty. We hunted it together when I was about your sister's age." "You shot it?" "Sam did." "Poor bear," Anne said. Cork nodded his agreement. He was a magnificent animal. "Why'd Sam shoot him?" "To save my life." "The bear was after you?" Anne looked up at him, eager for the story. "In the beginning, we were after the bear." "What happened?" "We followed him all day into the Quetico Superior Wilderness. That's what the boundary waters used to be called. We were in a part of the forest not even Sam knew." Cork rubbed the fur of the great skin and remembered. "We camped by a stream and talked late into the night. Next morning we were up early and tracking the bear again. By then, Sam had decided not to kill it, but we both wanted to see it, just to see such a creature." "You knew it was big?" "Oh, yes, and smart. We didn't know how smart. We tracked it to rocky ground, to an area full of boulders. After a while, it became clear that we'd lost the trail. There wasn't anything to do but turn back. We were both disappointed, Sam especially because he prided himself on his ability to track. But the bear had got the best of him." "If you lost his trail, how'd you kill him?" "I'm coming to that part." In the late afternoon, we came to a clearing, an old logged-over area full of sumac with a huge brush pile in the middle. We'd passed by before when we were tracking the bear, but this time Sam looked at the clearing, and it was like he smelled something. He told me to wait, and he disappeared into the sumac. Anne's eyes were huge, staring up into his face. "Then what?" "I waited, like Sam said. I waited a long time. I began to get worried. Then I saw the sumac rustling, and I thought Sam was coming back. But it wasn't Sam. It was the bear," Anne jumped in. "A monster of a bear," Cork said. It had circled and come back around behind us. I don't know if Sam scared it or if it had planned to attack, but there it was, charging at me out of the sumac. I was so scared I didn't even think to run. I just stood watching it come at me. When it was as close to me as you are right now, it stood up on its hind legs. Black bears are usually small, but this one towered over me. These claws you see here were ready to rip me apart. I was petrified, absolutely frozen with fear. Cork paused, fingering the long, sharp claws that were still the color of pearls. "What happened?" Anne demanded. "Sam shot him. I didn't even hear the shots, I was so scared. At first, nothing happened. The bear just wavered a little. Then it staggered back and fell. Sam came running out of the sumac. The bear tried again to get up, to defend itself, but it was hopeless. Sam looked sad. He spoke to the bear, said something in Ojibwe that I didn't understand. Then he finished it. Anne was quiet a moment, petting the soft black fur. "It's sad about the bear," she said, "but I'm glad he didn't kill you." "Me too, honey." Cork hugged her. "Lucky for you, Sam was a pretty good shot." "For you too, or you wouldn't even be here," he laughed. "Will you help me roll it back up? I think it's time to put it away again." As they rolled up the skin, Anne said, "I miss Sam." Cork said, "I miss him too." The memorial service for Judge Robert Parent was held at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. Although the judge hadn't been a man much loved, the church was crowded. The people who packed the pews were powerful, politically and financially. The state caucus was well represented. The Honorable Jim Galsworthy, whom Sandy would replace in the Senate, was there. The governor himself sent a telegram which Sandy read, praising the life work of Robert Parent. It was bullshit, Cork knew, but the somber congregation nodded their collective agreement. There was a gathering at Sandy Parent's home afterward. Cork, who'd insisted on driving Jo to the church, insisted on driving her to Parent's as well. "Why are you going?" she asked. "You didn't even like Bob." "Nobody liked the judge. Don't pretend you did." "He was a business associate," she said. "I have to go to these things." "Whither thou goest," Cork smiled. Jo didn't appear at all amused. "Father Tom talked to me today after church." "Oh?" Cork tried to sound surprised. "Cork, I really don't see any point in discussing our marriage anymore, with Father Tom or anybody else. I'm trying very hard to make a good end of it. So far it's been amicable, all things considered." "Amicable is a good beginning." "This isn't a beginning. The last couple of days, things have felt nice, almost normal again." "Don't set yourself up for a fall." She looked at him with genuine concern. "Don't fool yourself, Cork. Our marriage is over. It really and truly is." Outside town, Cork turned onto the long, wooded drive that led to Sandy Parent's place. Parent lived in a house like none Cork ever would. Surrounded by 10 acres of hardwood forest, mostly maple, it stood on a quarter-mile of the best shoreline Iron Lake had to offer. It was built on 3 levels, a little like books stacked slightly askew, and had so much window glass that, were it not for the wall of trees sequestering it, even Sandy Parent's pissing might not have been a private act. The long asphalt drive through the woods had been cleanly plowed, but a strong wind was blowing out of the northwest. Loose snow swirled across the road and danced up the banks of plowed snow. High clouds had closed overhead, and dark was coming on quickly in that late December afternoon. The house was already full of lights. "Did you hear me?" she asked. "I heard," he replied. But he stubbornly held to the priest's advice. Nothing is hopeless. The inside of Parent's house was done in cold white. Walls, rug, furniture, as if it were winter inside as well as out. A Christmas tree tastefully decorated with a modest number of white bulbs and red lights stood near the fireplace. 2 red stockings hung from the mantel. Sandy Parent wasn't married, and Cork wondered who the second stocking was for. There were hors d'oeuvres and punch and coffee on a long table, and 2 caterers keeping a close eye. When Cork's father had died, and again when his mother passed away, neighbors had come with food that filled the house on Gooseberry Lane with the smell of things freshly baked. It hadn't made the grief go away, but Cork remembered how it made him understand that his parents had been loved by a lot of folks besides him, and it made him feel good for his mother and father and for the lives they led. He didn't feel that way at the catered gathering for Judge Robert Parent. There was something calculated and distant about the carefully arranged platters of cold hors d'oeuvres. But he had to admit, they were tasty. Joe left him as soon as they stepped inside. Cork watched her huddle first with Parent and several state politicos, then with Parent and a number of local businessmen. She wore a simple black dress and a single strand of pearls. Her blonde hair was short and finely shaped. She looked beautiful. She stood among the men, not just holding her own, but being asked for advice. She was successful, and she wore that success well. As Cork watched, Sandy Parent touched her shoulder in a familiar way, leaned to her and whispered. It wasn't anything really, but it disturbed him. They looked like a couple, good together. How about some fresh air? Wally Shawno stepped up next to Cork, a cup of coffee in his huge right hand. He was dressed stiffly in a black suit and starched white shirt and dark blue tie. With his tall frame and hollow cheeks and stern gray eyes, he looked like a Bible-thumping minister bent on converting a world of sinners. Cork asked, Will Arletta be okay? She's with friends, Shawno said. Outside on the deck of the house, Cork lit up a Lucky Strike. The deck was a 2-level affair. The top level was quite large and had boxes along the railings that held flowers in the summer. The lower level was almost entirely taken up by a redwood hot tub. Cork had heard about that particular hot tub. For a bachelor like Parent, what Cork had heard was understandable. The backyard terraced down to the lake where there was a dock, empty now, and a large boathouse. Beyond that, the flat white of the frozen Iron Lakes stretched toward the evening sky. West beyond the bare trees of the Parents' woods, the lights of auroras sparkled along the shoreline, ending at the tip of North Point. As Cork leaned against the railing of the deck, the wind moved through the bare limbs of the trees with a sound like rushing water. The deck was protected, and Cork hardly felt the wind at all. I don't think about dying too much, Shawno said, looking away from Cork toward the lake. Not if I can help it. But you know, all I've been thinking today is that when I die, I want someone to feel sad about it. Shawno sipped his coffee. Find out anything from Wanda Manydeeds? She knows more than she's telling. They're afraid of something, Darla and her. Maybe Joe, John, and Paul too, and that's why they're hiding. Shawno leaned against the railing and shook his head. I still think it's a domestic dispute, Cork. They're Ojibwe. I don't blame them one bit for not wanting the law to get involved. There's something I haven't told you, Cork said. Somebody broke into Sam's place. Shawno abruptly straightened up. Burglary? They tore the place up, but nothing seemed to have been taken. Another thing, I think somebody's been in the house on Gooseberry Lane too. Maybe I should send a man over to dust for prints. I don't think dusting would turn up anything useful, and I don't want to scare my family. What were they after, Cork? If I knew that, I might know who they are. Shawno sipped his coffee. Cork smoked his cigarette. The wind shifted a little and began to move snow across the deck. Cork was feeling chilled. Maybe there's something I ought to tell you, Shawno said. I'm listening. I had a visit from the ATF recently. A couple of agents stopped by my office. They're interested in the Minnesota Civilian Brigade. I covered the same territory with the FBI when I was sheriff. They didn't seem too concerned. The ATF seems that somebody's been pumping money into the group. The brigade's better organized than it was before. The ATF's afraid they may be arming themselves pretty heavily. Where's the money coming from? That's what the agents wanted to know. Shawno looked at Cork with a curious expression. You know, Cork, strange things have been going on around here, starting with the judge's death. You were alone in the judge's house a long time before me and my men got there. I was there a while. Why? I'm just wondering if maybe somebody thinks you took something. I'm wondering if they think you've got something that belonged to the judge. Are you wondering if I took something, Wally? I didn't say that. But maybe somebody, maybe the brigade, for example, thinks you did. And if what they think you took has anything to do with the judge being dead. Shawno turned his hard gray eyes on Cork. The door onto the deck opened, and Arletta Shawno stepped out. How do you do? She said politely to Cork, as if he were a stranger. Arletta, Cork smiled back. Wally dear, I think we should go home soon. The children? The children are all right, Shawno said without a hint of annoyance. They're not home. Arletta gave him a distressed look. Maybe I should call. No. Shawno put his arm around her and drew her close to keep her warm. No, it's time we left anyway. He glanced at Cork. I'm thinking this is a thing you need to stay way clear of. For your family's sake, you understand? But if you hear anything about Joe John or the boy, you let me know. Cork nodded. You look lovely, Arletta. Night. He stayed on the deck a while, finishing his cigarette. He was just about to head back in when Joe came out. Cork, Rose is on the telephone for you. What is it? I don't know. She wants to talk to you. He took the call in the kitchen where the caterers were working on trays of food. What is it, Rose? She spoke in a hush. Harlan Litton called. He wants you to call him as soon as you can. Did he say why? No, but he sounded scary, Cork, and he didn't sound sober. Thanks, Rose. Is everything okay there, the kids? Fine, everything here is fine. I've made sure the doors are locked. Good. I'll call Harlan. And Rose? Yes? Thanks. Litton answered right away, as if he'd been watching the phone and waiting to pounce. O'Connor, it's about time. Listen, I got something you want to see. Litton had a raspy voice. Drunk, it was like splinters. What is it? Cork asked. Not over the phone. Get your ass out here. It's late, Harlan. Can't it wait until tomorrow? Oh, Connor, you fuck. Get over here. What I got to show you, you'll want to see. All right, Harlan. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Joe and Sandy Parent were standing together in the living room talking quietly. I've got to go, Cork told her. Everything's okay at home? Joe asked. Everything's fine. I'm going out to see Harlan Litton. Litton? Parent said. Why on earth do you want to see him? He says he's got something to show me. I can take you home first, Joe. I'm not ready yet, she said. I'll see she gets home, Parent assured Cork. Cork shook his hand. Nice memorial for your father. He was a good man, Parent said. He deserved it. Sure, Cork thought. And monkeys fly out my butt. Chapter 21. The wind had turned fierce, a bitter southern wind. It made the trees sway and the loose snow rise up, so that occasionally the road was lost in brief ground blizzards. On his way to Litton's, Cork heard the forecast. More snow, plunging temperatures. He parked on the road. Litton hadn't yet plowed himself out, and the lane leading to his cabin was heavily drifted over. Cork had stopped by the house on Gooseberry Lane to change his clothes and to strap on his belt and holster in his .38. He double-checked the cylinder, snapped it back in place, and got out of the Bronco. What Litton had in mind he couldn't even guess at, but things were strange in Aurora these days, and he didn't want to be caught unprepared. Even in the shelter of the woods, the branches of the trees whipped about wildly. The trunks of the birch and tamarack moaned as they twisted and strained. The wind slapped his face. Little crystals of ice hit him like needles and made his eyes water. The sound of the wind through the trees swallowed every other noise. In the lane, Cork felt vulnerable. But the woods were full of bogs, and he didn't want to leave the certainty of the solid ground. He unbuttoned his coat and reached in to be sure he could get to his revolver quickly. He watched the woods carefully as he crept toward Litton's cabin. 3/4 of the way in, the clear crack of a high-powered rifle from the direction of Litton's place made Cork hit the snow and roll. He scrambled off the open lane and hunkered down under the low branches of a small tamarack and waited. He breathed hard and thought fast. Would Litton really try to kill him because of the dog? Was that what this was about? Litton was a mean son of a bitch and torn up over the death of the Ripper. But was he so stupid or so confused by grief that he'd lead a man into an ambush he'd advertised so broadly? Maybe it was exactly what a man would do when he lost what he most loved. Cork risked a peek around the base of the tree. The ground all around was a tangle of brush and vine clumps. Nothing moved. A minute had passed. Cork replayed the sound of the shot in his head. It had come from the direction of Litton's cabin. That didn't mean that Litton had fired it or that Cork was the target. He'd been an easy mark on the road, and Litton was a good shot. He crouched and stumbled forward to the next tree. He made for the next tree, leaping brush and vines in an open run. Only moments before, he'd been freezing. But as he knelt behind a slender birch and strained to listen, sweat trickled down his temples. He heard nothing but the incessant rush of the wind and the creak and moan of the living woods. Carefully, he stepped back out onto the lane and crept toward the cabin. The lights were on, the cabin door ajar. Cork could see that the front window had been shattered. Wind tore at the curtain inside. He crouched behind the cover of a fallen tree as someone stepped into the doorway. Against the light inside, only the dark outline of the figure and a long rifle barrel were clear. The figure slumped a moment against the door jamb, as if exhausted or maybe wounded, then gathered itself and started around the cabin toward the woods and back. Cork readied his revolver and hollered into the wind, "Stop! Police!" The figure turned, scanned the woods, and wildly fired. The tree trunk high above Cork splintered and flakes of bark showered down. The figure turned and ran for the deep woods. Cork sighted, but held off pulling the trigger. "Stop, goddammit!" The warning shot Cork fired into the air didn't make any difference. In a moment, the figure was lost in the darkness in the far woods. Cork dashed to the open door of the cabin. Litton lay on the floor, face down. His back was a bleeding mess. Cork knelt beside him and found a weak pulse in Litton's neck. He grabbed the phone that hung on the wall and called the sheriff's office. Litton's eyes were open when Cork came back to him. A pool of blood had oozed from beneath him and was slowly spreading across the bare cabin floor. Cork knelt beside him and leaned close to his ear. "Harlan, this is Cork O'Connor. Hang on. An ambulance is on the way. Harlan, can you hear me?" Litton's eyes were yellow-brown, the color of new pine wood. He had a mole on his left cheek that somehow Cork had never noticed before. His ear was small with a long lobe. He smelled raw, smelled of the thick, unpleasant odor of blood. Cork felt again at Litton's neck. This time he found no pulse. He considered pumping Litton's chest, trying to push his heart back into a rhythm. But the man had a hole in him big as a fist, and Cork was pretty certain anything he tried would be useless. In the stillness he shared with the dead man, Cork heard the sound of a snowmobile far out in the woods. As he listened, the snowmobile grew distant, and then could be heard no more. He sat beside Litton, enormously tired. He was no stranger to brutal death. Both as sheriff and as a cop on Chicago's South Side, he'd seen his share of dying. Murder, accident, overdose. It happened in many ways, but the end was the same. Something sad and confusing left behind. Only the shape of life. Only the empty outline. He stood up. There was nothing more he could do. The ooze of Litton's blood had stained his pant leg. The sole of his right boot put a bloody print on the floor, contaminating the scene. But what was done was done. He wondered what it was Litton had wanted to show him, wondered if it had anything to do with the man's death. From where he stood, he looked the cabin over. It was small but efficient. Bunk, table, stove, refrigerator, sink, all in the one room. Litton wasn't a good housekeeper. A clutter of dirty dishes sat in the sink. The stove was like an erupted volcano with streams of old cooking hardened on the top and sides. Clothes lay wadded on and around the bunk where they'd been carelessly tossed. However, the cabin walls were different. They were carefully decorated with framed photographs, landscapes of the North Woods, the rapids of a small stream, a deer bent to its feeding in an empty meadow, a pond at sunset. Cork was surprised. In the home of Harlan Litton, he'd expected to see something harsher hanging, something on the order of stuffed animals or mounted heads. The north end of the cabin had been walled off with plywood into a small second room. Cork took his handkerchief and wiped the blood from his boot, then crossed to the door and opened it. Inside, he pulled a cord to turn on an overhead bulb. It was a dark room. There was a sink and trays for developing, an enlarger, shelves full of chemical containers, and camera equipment. The equipment was sophisticated, lots of complicated lenses. A few prints hung from a line. Cork took a close look. Winter photos, black and white, of delicate ice formations on the rocks of a small stream. They were surprisingly good. He found other prints sitting on a counter, some in black and white, others in color. They were lovely, and that surprised the hell out of him. He would never have thought it of Harlan Litton. He opened the drawers under the cabinet. Miscellaneous supplies, a drawer with strips of negatives. Cork lifted a couple of the strips. Wildlife shots. He opened the largest of the drawers, but it was completely empty. Back in the other room, he wandered the cabin a bit, looking over everything for anything. He checked the small bathroom. There, as everywhere else, Harlan was careless in his cleaning. Cork could hear sirens down on the road approaching Litton's lane. When he turned back and took a good look at the dead man from another angle, he saw the corner of a manila folder sticking out from under the body. He knelt beside Litton, trying to avoid the blood. There was something written on the raised corner of the file folder. The sirens had gone silent, which probably meant they'd reached the lane and were trying to figure how to get to the cabin through the deep snow. He lifted Litton's body carefully and took the folder off the floor. It was soaked in blood. The scrawl of the handwriting was quite clear, however. In black pen on the label was written, Joe O'Connor. Cork's hands cradled the bloody folder. He opened it. Inside were several black and white photographs. They appeared to have been taken at night with some type of night vision lens. In the first photograph, Cork clearly recognized the home of Sandy Parent. It was a view from the lake and showed the dock and boathouse, the long backyard, the house on 3 levels, the decks. There were 2 white forms near the hot tub. Cork could hear the bump and scrape of a plow clearing the lane for the sheriff's cars. The second photograph was an enlargement of the first, with the details enhanced. The enlargement centered on the hot tub. The white forms were 2 people, clearly naked. The plow stopped. Cork could hear car doors slamming shut outside the cabin and men shouting to one another. In the third photograph, a further enlargement with the details grainy but distinct, Cork could see that the 2 people were making love. The woman was bent slightly forward, leaning on the hot tub for support. The man held her hips, his pelvis shoved against her buttocks, entering her from behind. Sandy Parent's grainy face was lifted toward heaven. Joe's eyes were closed, but her mouth was open in what looked to be a little moan of ecstasy. Cork closed the folder and slid it under his coat, a moment before Wally Shawno and his men came through the door. Chapter 22. "And you don't have any idea what it was he wanted to show you?" Shano said, repeating what Cork had already told him. "If I knew that, Wally, I wouldn't have come all the way out here. He died without saying a word." Shano looked down at the dead man, then at Cork. "If the Ripper was alive, the Ripper would have warned him." "No," Cork said. "The Ripper would have torn the killer apart." "Litton's bad luck," Shano said. "Yeah," Cork agreed. "Litton's luck." "I'm going to have to take your firearm," Shano said. "I understand. And those clothes, they've got blood all over them." Shano glanced around and his eyes settled on a young rookie, Jack Wozniak. "Jack, I want you to follow Cork home. Get the clothes he's wearing and bring them back to the office." He eyed Cork again, shook his head in a frustrated way, and said, "I don't want you doing anything else on your own, okay?" "If I'd known it was going to turn out this way, I'd have invited you." Cork started toward the open door. "I'll want to talk to you some more tomorrow," Shano called after him. "You'll be home?" Home? Cork thought about it. No, he wouldn't be home. He wouldn't be home ever again. "I'll be around," he said. It was almost midnight when he reached the house on Gooseberry Lane. The back door was locked, and all was quiet inside. Cork told Wozniak to wait in the kitchen and asked if he wanted some coffee and cookies. Wozniak said no thanks to the coffee, but he did accept one of Rose's chocolate chip cookies. Cork went upstairs to change. He cleared the bottom drawer of his dresser and put the folder there. The manila was stiff and black with dried blood. He took off his clothes and hung them carefully on hangers. After putting on a robe, he walked the bloody clothing downstairs. "I'm sorry about this, Cork," the deputy said, looking genuinely guilty about the whole thing. "Standard procedure, let it go. Good night, Jack." Cork checked Joe's room. She wasn't there. He took a shower, put on clean boxer shorts and a clean t-shirt, and went to bed. The wind shook the windows and made the house creak and groan. In a few minutes he heard the sound of Stevie's footy pajamas shuffling down the hallway. It was only a soft shushing, but it was a sound that could bring Cork up in an instant, even from the deepest sleep. In a minute, Stevie was at his bedside. "What's up, buddy?" Cork asked. Stevie clutched his stuffed doll named Peter and stared at his father in the dark. The window pane shuddered. Stevie glanced toward it and said a single word, whispered in terror. "Monsters." "Monsters." Cork nodded gravely. He pushed himself up. "Come on, let's go have a look." Stevie pointed to the closet, and Cork searched there. Stevie indicated the ultimate blackness beneath his bed, and Cork knelt and demanded all monsters come out now. Nothing came, but Stevie grasped his father as if he'd seen a ghost and pointed to the window. "Outside," he said. Together they pressed their noses to the frigid glass. Around the house swirled a white rush, loose snow and wind, and the great elm in the backyard waved its branches as if dreadfully alive. What Cork saw was the awesome power of nature. But for Stevie, it was simply the confirmation of his nightmares. "Only the wind, Steve," Cork explained gently. "It's noisy, but it's only wind." "Monsters," Stevie insisted with a defiant certainty of some terror to come. Cork guided him back to bed. "Would you like me to lie down with you a while?" In that instant, Stevie's fear vanished. Cork knew it wasn't manipulation, only a son's naive trust in his father's stature. What were monsters, after all, to a man who could touch the ceiling? Cork lay down beside him. Stevie made himself into a little ball, his breath breaking warm and sweet against Cork's face. In only a minute he was breathing steadily again, sleeping. It was time for Cork to return to the bed in the guest room, but he lingered beside this son who trusted him, lay awake knowing there were monsters in the wind outside, that his son's fear was not unjustified, and that Stevie would have to face them alone someday. There were people out there so cruel they would wound him for the pleasure of it. Dreadful circumstances no man in his worst imaginings could conjure. Disappointments so overwhelming they would crush his dreams like eggshells. For a child like Stevie, a child of special graces, there would be such pain that Cork nearly wept in anticipation of it. Against those monsters a father was powerless, but against the simple terrors of the night he would do his best. He heard Jo come in the front door, and a moment later the sound of her feet on the stairs. He slid from Stevie's bed and stepped into the hallway. Jo came up the stairs, her hands behind her neck, undoing her pearls. She looked tired. "Still awake?" she asked. "I thought everybody would be asleep." "Sandy bring you home?" "Yes." She got the pearls off and tried to move by him toward her bedroom, but Cork blocked her way. "You stayed a long time," he said. "We were working on business." "You've been working on business a lot with Sandy." "I'm his attorney, Cork." "Is that all you are?" Jo stepped back. "What are you talking about?" "I thought it was me," Cork said. He shook his head stupidly. "All along I thought it was my fault. Christ, how blind can a man be?" Jo watched him closely but said nothing. "Do you love him?" Jo didn't answer. "Are you planning on marrying him as soon as I'm out of the picture?" His voice rose as if Jo's silence was only because she couldn't hear him. "Are you?" In Anne's room, the bed creaked. "Not here," Jo said. Cork turned and walked angrily to the guest room. Jo followed and closed the door. "Well?" Cork said. Jo stayed by the door, her hands behind her back, gripping the knob. "You lied to me," Cork accused. "No, I just didn't tell you." "Bullshit." "I didn't want you to know. Sandy's in a vulnerable position. He's a very public figure, and I'm still technically a married woman." "But that's not your fault, is it? Lord knows you've done everything you can to hurry this along." "Cork, how long?" "What do you mean?" "How long has it been going on?" She sighed, closed her eyes. "A while." "A long while," Cork corrected her. "Cork, I didn't like not telling you. But how could I? It would have been all over Aurora, and Sandy's standing could have been terribly damaged." "Sandy's standing?" Cork looked at her, his eyes wide with a kind of horror. "Who are you, Jo? I don't even know you anymore." "I didn't do it to hurt you. It just happened, Cork." Everything in him felt drawn taut, ready to snap. He could feel his right temple twitching as if there were something under his skin trying to break out. "When?" he asked. "When did it just happen? After I was out of your bed? Out of the house? When?" "Yes." "Yes, what?" "After you were out of the house." "You wouldn't lie to me." "Why would I lie?" Cork went to the dresser and pulled out the folder stained with Litton's blood. He held it out to Jo. She drew back in revulsion. "What's that?" "Take it. Open it." He thrust it at her. She put the pearls on his bed, gingerly took the folder in her hands and carefully opened it. She studied the photographs. Cork watched her face go pale as her pearls. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Where did these come from?" "Does it matter? Look at the lower corner of each of them. There's a time date stamp. Those pictures were taken the summer after Sam Wintermoon died. I wasn't out then, Jo. Or I guess I was, and just didn't know it, huh?" She looked ill, drained of all her color. "What difference does it make now, Cork?" He turned away and went to the window. He watched the elm tree in the yard writhe in the wind like a creature in pain. "What did I do to deserve this, Jo?" "The world doesn't revolve around you, Cork," she said. Her voice was flat and cold and hard like frozen ground. "Everything doesn't happen because of you. Some things just happen." She moved behind him toward the bed. He heard the soft rustle of her dress. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see her at all. "I've been trying to tell you," she said. "Don't get your hopes up. Didn't I say that? But you wouldn't listen. You didn't want to hear. It's over between us, Cork. And Sandy Parent is the reason." There was a long stillness. Then Joe said, "I suppose." "Get out." "Cork, just get out." He heard the door open, heard her leave, heard the sound down the hallway of her own door closing. He turned and saw that she'd put the folder on the bed and taken her pearls. For a long time he stood at the window listening to the howl of the wind outside. If it was true, as Henry Malou said, that he'd heard the Wendigo call his name, he understood why now. Because it felt exactly as if his heart had just been torn out of him and devoured. Chapter 23. Joe lay awake in the black of 4 a.m., remembering a moment before it all fell apart. She and Cork out at Russell Blackwater's trailer in the hours before the shootings at Burke's Landing. She recalled them holding one another and feeling a terrible numbness where caring should have been. She'd blamed it on the circumstances, the weight of what each of them carried that night, the responsibilities. But it wasn't that. They were holding something dying, maybe already dead, but they were too scared to admit it. She wondered why the tragedy at Burke's Landing hadn't brought them together. Adversity was supposed to do that, wasn't it? Instead, everything got worse. Cork wasn't just distant. Something in him seemed to have died, along with the other deaths that drizzly morning. Nothing mattered. Not his job, his family, her. He called out in the night sometimes, sat bolt upright and grabbed at the air. What was it he was reaching for? The past? Was he trying to pull the dead men back? Trying to pull them all back? She never knew. He wouldn't talk about it. Near dawn, she heard Cork moving about. She put on her robe, went downstairs to the living room, and sat tensely on the sofa to wait for him. When he came down, she stood up and clutched the robe around her throat as if she were freezing. "Cork," she said. The living room was dark. He seemed startled by her presence. "What?" he grumbled. "Could we talk?" "I'm on my way out." "We need to talk." "What's there to talk about? You made everything clear." "I don't want us to finish things all bitter and angry." "What am I supposed to do, shake your hand and thank you kindly for leaving me for another man?" "Could we just talk for a while?" "You said yesterday you didn't want to talk about our marriage anymore, so what's changed?" "You're hurt. I didn't want that." "What difference does it make to you?" "I know you might not believe this, but I care about you." Cork was a solid darkness within the dark of the living room. Joe could see that he held the gym bag he'd used to bring his clothing from Sam's place, and he held his rolled-up bearskin. "Could we talk in my office? Please." Cork didn't answer, but he didn't leave. Joe took that as a good sign and led the way. In her office, she closed the door behind them, then switched on the lamp on her desk. They both blinked a moment at the light. "You look tired," she said. "I didn't sleep." "Me either." "You know what I did, Joe? I lay awake putting it all together, all the signs, signals. I could see it now, in neon. But you know, what I couldn't put together was where it began." "I don't think you need to know the details. I don't think that would do anybody any good." "You wanted to talk? This is what I want to talk about." Joe leaned against the oak desk, thankful for the support of the solid wood. "It was after the shooting at Burke's Landing, when Sandy and I were down in St. Paul together working to negotiate a settlement before any more blood was spilled. Things were intense. It just happened." "Just happened." Cork shook his head. We were drifting already, Cork. Don't deny it. There were days we'd come home and not say more than a dozen words to one another. And then it was to talk about money or the kids' school things or the most recent rumor making the rounds in Aurora. I don't know. Maybe we thought we knew each other so well we didn't have to talk. If that was it, we were wrong. Because every night it felt as if I was going to bed with a stranger. Even when we made love? By then we were just having sex, Cork. I don't even know when we stopped making love. Cork set his gym bag down and put the bearskin on top of it. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back against the door. And along comes Sandy Parent with his good looks and his money and just sweeps you off your feet. It wasn't his money or his looks. I needed someone, Cork. We're not all as strong and self-contained as you are. Oh yeah, I was real strong after Burke's Landing. Hell, I couldn't even muster the energy to fight the recall petition. I could have used a little support then. I tried to reach out, Cork, but you were like something made of ice. It was like everything in you had frozen over. There wasn't any warmth toward me or the kids. Stevie was afraid to go near you, for Christ's sake. And that's why you asked me to leave. It didn't have anything to do with Sandy Parent, he said with bitter sarcasm. Joe looked down. You're right. It probably had a lot to do with Sandy. Christ, Joe. Do you know how long I felt like shit? Felt like everything was all my fault? I know, Cork, I know. The truth is, she confessed, I let you believe it because it made things easier for me. There was a knock at the door. Rose poked her head in and smiled. I'm about to start breakfast. Anyone interested? She glanced down and saw Cork's gym bag and the bearskin. Then she looked sadly at the two of them. I won't be staying, Rose, Cork told her. Thanks anyway. Jenny pushed in behind her, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Dad, I want to feed the geese. She yawned. Can you take me to school? We can stop by Sam's place on the way. She looked carefully at the three adults, then at Cork's things on the floor. She seemed wide awake suddenly. You're going back? Yeah, but I'll give you a ride so you can feed the geese. No thanks, she said. It doesn't matter now. She turned and shoved past Rose out the door. Rose eyed them both again, gave her head a faint shake of disapproval and stepped out. I'm sorry, Joe said. Who isn't? Cork picked up his gym bag, hefted the bearskin, and left. A dirty van waited outside Sam's place, the engine running. On the side, barely readable through the crust of grit, was printed, Winterbauer Plumbing and Heating. Art Winterbauer stepped out. He held coffee in a big paper cup from Jeannie's Donuts, and there was a splotch of white cream filling on his upper lip. I promised you first thing, Cork, and first thing, here I am. Freeze your butt over the weekend? He was a short man with a square body and square face. He wore a hat with flaps that hung down the side like the ears of a basset hound. Sliding his van door open, he pulled out a heavy toolbox. He carried his coffee in one hand, his toolbox in the other. I took your advice, stayed somewhere else. Cork unlocked the door. Winterbauer stepped in and saw the mess. Christ, what happened in here? You know where everything is, Cork replied without answering. Yeah, Winterbauer said, looking at the destruction around him. But is it still there? I'll be outside if you need me, Cork told him, and left. He dug into the grain sack and took the bucket of dried corn out to the lake. A light snow was falling. The flakes settled on the gray open water and disappeared. At first he didn't see Romeo and Juliet. Then he spotted them huddled under a safety station at the edge of the ice. They seemed oddly subdued, quiet and motionless, and didn't appear to be in any hurry to feed. A maroon Taurus station wagon pulled up beside Winterbauer's van. Helmut Hanover, editor of the Aurora Sentinel, stepped out, spotted Cork, and started toward him. Hanover was a tall, slender man in his mid-40s. A veteran of Vietnam, He had left the lower part of his right leg on a rice paddy dike, courtesy of a Claymore mine. He had a prosthetic appendage and walked with a slight limp. He'd begun to bald young, a characteristic he'd chosen to exaggerate by shaving his head clean. With his narrow face, blue, unkind eyes, and that shaved head like a cleaned bone, he had an intimidating austerity about him, not unlike a sharply honed knife. Although his byline read Helm Hanover, he was unaffectionately known as Hell Hanover by anyone who'd been the target of his editorials, and Cork had. During the spearfishing business, Hanover had flayed Cork alive. Helm exercised a good deal of wisdom and restraint in publishing the Sentinel, which was a small-town paper devoted to small-town news, commissioners' meetings, church bazaars, births, obituaries. He crammed as many names in a story as he possibly could, and he was sure to spell them all correctly. In reporting the local news, he generally kept things about as controversial as cottage cheese. But in his editorials and the letters to the editor section, he allowed a lot of latitude. Consequently, the Sentinel was frequently a voice for all the crackpot philosophies at liberty in Tamarack County. He'd printed odes to the Posse Comitatus, elegies to the Branch Davidians, proclamations of supremacy from the Minnesota Civilian Brigade, all with a nod toward the First Amendment. His own editorials generally carried a sharp, bitter edge, and more often than not, the target of his criticism was government, in any form. Helm Hanover had no use for the distant, inept interference of the federal government, particularly. Cork suspected a lot of this was a deep, burning anger that went all the way back to the flesh and bone Hell had left in Vietnam. "Morning, Cork," Hanover said. He nodded stiffly in greeting. "Helm," Cork said. "I don't suppose you're out here hoping for a burger and a shake. I've just come from the sheriff's office. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Hanover took a small notebook and pencil from the pocket of the down vest he wore. "About last night." The geese were slowly making their way to shore, black ripples following in the gray water. Cork watched the geese. He didn't want to look at Hell Hanover. The man always made him angry. "What exactly did the sheriff tell you?" Cork asked. "I'd like it to be in your own words," Hanover said. "My words? Wally's words? What difference does it make? You've got the facts." Cork set the empty bucket in the snow. Hanover glanced in as if there might be something worth writing about inside it. "The sheriff said Litton called you. He wanted to show you something. What was it he wanted to show you?" "If he hadn't been killed, I might know." "You haven't got any idea? When he called, he didn't say anything?" "He only said to come out." "Why did you feel compelled to go?" "You wouldn't understand." "Anything to do with killing his dog?" Cork glanced over and found Hanover's hard, unkind eyes watching him closely, his sharp pencil poised above his notebook. "Who told you about the dog?" "Might have been the same person who told me about the Wendigo. I heard the Wendigo called his name. Is that true?" Cork looked Hanover in the eye. "You're a newspaper man, Helm. You deal in facts. The Wendigo is a myth." "It wasn't a myth that killed Harlan Litton." "My point exactly." "Did you see the assailant?" "Just a silhouette." "Can you describe him?" "Why do you say him, Helm? There's nothing sexist about murder. Women kill too." "Can you describe the assailant?" Hanover corrected. "You can get my description from the sheriff." Cork bent and lifted the bucket. The geese seemed reluctant to come to shore with Hanover there. Cork turned back toward Sam's place. Hanover limped after him. "Funny thing about that dog," Hanover said at his back. "If you hadn't shot him, he might have warned Litton." Cork stopped. "What are you getting at, Helm?" Hanover shrugged innocently. "I'm not getting at anything, Cork. I'm just asking questions. It's my job." "But it's not mine to answer them. You want to know anything about Litton's death, talk to Wally Shawno. He's paid for it." Hanover wrote in his notebook. Cork went on ahead. Hanover caught up with him at the door to Sam's place. "Just one more question. When the judge died, you were there. When Litton died, you were there. If you were on the outside looking in, wouldn't that strike you as a little funny?" "See you around, Helm." Cork eyed him pointedly until the newspaper man turned and limped back to his wagon. Hanover took out the notebook again and stood in the falling snow, writing. He glanced back at Cork, then slipped into the wagon and drove away. Cork stood in the doorway. As much as he hated to, he had to agree with Hell. It was a little funny. By the time Cork reached the old firehouse, the new snow had given a soft, fluffy covering to everything. Parents' white BMW sat in the parking lot. The windshield was still clear, and Cork figured Parent hadn't been there long. Joyce Sandoval glanced up from her computer screen and eyed Cork over her half-glasses. "I heard about last night," she said. "It sounds awful." "I'd like to see Sandy." "Sure," she said, and reached for the phone. "Just a moment." She punched in 3 numbers. "Corcoran O'Connor is here to see you." She listened a moment, then hung up. "He'll be with you in a moment." "Are you all right?" "Fine, Joyce," Cork replied, and turned abruptly away. He stood in front of a picture in the hallway, a framed aerial shot of Aurora. Yellow pins that indicated Great North Holdings covered the map like small pustules. The subdivision called Larkin Hills, the Aurora Mall, the Four Seasons condominiums, the Aurora Office Park. The newest and most expensive of the holdings was also there, the Chippewa Grand Casino. Along the bottom of the enlarged photograph was the inked inscription, "Happy birthday, Sandy. The Judge." "He'll see you now," Joyce said. Parent stepped out of his office just as Cork reached the top of the stairs. He eyed Cork steadily. "I've been expecting you. I talked with Joe this morning." "Talked? I didn't think that was what you and Joe did together." Parent was dressed for business, blue suit, white shirt, red silk tie. The fragrance of a fine musk cologne scented the air around him. "One of the things," he replied calmly. The door across the hall opened and Parent's secretary stepped out. "Mr. Parent," she began. "Can it wait, Helen?" Parent asked. "Cork and I were just about to have a conference in my office." "Oh, sure," Helen said, and turned away. "Why don't we step inside to discuss this?" Parent suggested. Exposed beams ran across the ceiling of Sandy Parent's office. It had the same effect as a weightlifter showing his biceps, strength on display. Parent's desk was very large, very dark, and very shiny. The papers on it were in small, neat stacks. Parent went to a table near the window and picked up a silver pot. "Coffee?" "I didn't come on a social call." Parent poured coffee into a white porcelain cup. "What are you here for, Cork? Want to take a swing at me?" He stirred in sugar and cream. "I want to ask a question." "Only one?" Parent carefully tasted his coffee. "Do you intend to marry her?" Parent walked casually back to his desk and set the cup down. "I don't see that that's any of your business." "She comes with baggage," Cork said. "Baggage? You mean the children?" He looked at Cork disdainfully. "I'd never refer to my children as baggage." "They'll never be your kids. You may get my wife, but you'll never get my kids." Parent sat on the edge of his desk, his hands folded calmly in his lap. He had the air of a high school principal sadly disappointed in the behavior of a student. "Would you use them like weapons, Cork? What kind of father are you that you have to fight me through your children?" "I don't have to fight through my children." "I don't think you have it in you to fight any other way." Cork exploded and lunged at him. Parent seemed to have anticipated the move and ducked so that he caught Cork full in the chest with the top of his shoulder. They tumbled back. Parent came up with a hard punch to Cork's ribs that felt like the butt end of a log. Then he danced easily away. Intramural boxing champ at Harvard. He grinned at Cork. Cork charged again, wrapping up Parent in his thick arms. They went down heavily, knocking the phone off Parent's desk and toppling his chair. Parent hammered jabs at the place on Cork's ribs where he'd landed the first jarring blow, the same area that had taken a beating a couple of days earlier at Sam's place. The pain made Cork let go. Parent rolled away and bounded up, his hands fisted. Cork struggled up too, just as Parent's office door opened and his secretary stepped in. She stood a moment looking at the two men. "Oh," she said when she understood. "I saw your line go on and I thought—" "That's all right, Helen," Parent said, dropping his hands. He straightened his red silk tie and brushed his blue suit. "We were just finishing our discussion. I'll be with you in a minute." The woman nodded, glanced at Cork, and backed quickly out. Parent ran his hand through his hair and looked smooth as ever. He moved back to his desk, picked up the phone, and righted the fallen chair. "Joe said you had photographs. Where'd you get them?" Cork's ribs hurt every time he took a breath, but he didn't want Parent to know. "Does it matter?" "I'd like to know who's so interested in my private life." "You're a senator now. You haven't got a private life." "What are you going to do with the photos?" "I haven't decided." Parent sat down and eyed Cork with an unruffled air. "I'm sure you can't hurt me, Cork, but if you try, I'll squash you like a bug." "I'm shivering in my boots, Sandy." He turned to leave. As he reached for the door and opened it, Parent said at his back, "I'm used to winning, Cork. It's what I do best." Outside, Cork got into the Bronco. He undid his shirt and looked at the place where his ribs hurt like hell. The skin was already a brooding purple from the beating he took at Sam's place. There seemed to be a yellow-green border developing around the bruise. He wondered if Parent had broken anything. He reached into his shirt pocket for a lucky strike and hauled out a crushed pack. He extracted a bent cigarette, straightened it out, and lit up. After that, he sat for a while staring at the windshield that was blanketed with snow. Eventually, he opened the gym bag. He hadn't looked at the pictures since the night before. There was no point in looking again. He knew that. No point except to feed the coldness inside him. In a strange way, that was exactly what he wanted now. He wanted to feed himself to the cold until the cold had consumed him, and he didn't care anymore. He stared at the folder. Manila, old and beaten. Doodles on the outside. Although dried blood obscured some things, others were quite clear. Squares, circles, scribbles, a word here and there. Idle scrawl. But there was something about that scrawl. It was different from the writing on the label that said, Joe O'Connor. He crushed out his cigarette in the ashtray and stepped from the Bronco. Folder in hand and moving gingerly because of his ribs, he hurried back into the building. He ignored Joyce Sandoval's questioning glance and went straight to the aerial photo hanging on the wall. He studied the handwritten inscription on the matting. Happy birthday, Sandy, the judge. The late Judge Robert Parent had written with a peculiarly grand flourish. Cork looked at the folder. The doodled words on the bloody cover were in the same hand. The folder hadn't originally belonged to Harlan Litton. It had belonged to another dead man first.
This ends Disc 5. Iron Lake, Disc 6.
Chapter 24. He'd always loved winter in the North Woods. The clean feel of a new snow, the icy air almost brittle in his nostrils, the way sound carried forever. He could hear Walleye barking a long way off as he parked his Bronco on the frozen lake, climbed the rocky slope of Crow's Point, and made for Henry Maloo's cabin. The world felt empty of everything except that sound. Malou stepped out as Cork approached. He was wiping his hands on a rag. Big snowflakes caught in his white hair as he stood waiting. "Corcoran O'Connor," the old man said with a smile. Walleye, who was on a rope tied to a metal peg driven into the cabin wall, wagged his tail and nuzzled Cork's crotch. "You don't seem surprised to see me, Henry," Cork said. "When you are my age, you will be surprised by little too." He looked at Cork with concern. "You are moving like a man my age." "A little accident," Cork said. He gently touched his ribs. "I have made bean soup," the old man offered. "We'll eat." He untied the dog, turned, and led the way inside. The cabin smelled of the soup, a thick, tantalizing aroma. Cork realized he hadn't eaten at all that day, hadn't even been hungry until he smelled the soup. From his coat pocket he pulled an unopened pack of Lucky Strikes and gave them to the old man. Malou seemed pleased. "After we eat," he nodded, "we can smoke together." Malou filled 2 chipped bowls and brought them to the table. He brought bread in a basket and poured coffee from the blue speckled pot that had jumped by itself the day Molly had been there. Walleye sat patiently on his haunches, watching carefully for anything that might come his way. With the wooden ladle, the old man fished a bone the size of a child's fist from the soup pot and put it on the floor. The dog waited until Malou called him. They ate without a word, but not in silence. The old man slurped from his spoon and lapped at the residue of soup along the edges of his lips. In the way of someone used to keeping company with himself, he occasionally mumbled toward his bowl. On the floor, Walleye gnawed greedily on the soup bone. When Malou was finished, he took the pack of Lucky Strikes Cork had given him and drew out a cigarette. He offered the pack to Cork, then lit his own cigarette with a wooden kitchen match he struck on the underside of his chair. He settled back and seemed quite pleased. "You make an old man feel pretty good, Corcoran O'Connor," he said. "It is a long, hard way here even without snow, but you visit me often now." He gave Cork an ironic smile. Cork leaned his forearms on the table and bent toward the old man. "Harlan Litton is dead, Henry." The old man took a long, slow puff from his cigarette. "You're not surprised," Cork said. "Death is no surprise to an old man like me. Being able to take a regular crap, now, there is a surprise." "Why did you tell me about the Wendigo calling his name? Did you think I could do something?" "Once the Wendigo has called a man's name, there's nothing anyone can do." Cork sat back, eyed the old man, and took a long shot in the dark. "But you told Russell Blackwater the Wendigo had called his name." Something showed in the old man's face, a glimmer of concern, but it passed quickly. Cork knew he'd hit home, and he pressed Malou. "The night I took you into town, you went to the casino, but not to gamble. You wanted to talk with Russell Blackwater. Did you hear the Wendigo call his name? Is that why you walked into town in the middle of a blizzard? To warn him?" The old man took the cigarette from his lips and looked at Cork appreciatively. "The whites were wrong to kick you out as sheriff." "Did he believe you?" Malou shrugged. "It makes no difference if he believes or not. He will still face the Wendigo." "Why warn him and not Litton?" "Vernon Blackwater's son is one of the people. Harlan Litton was not." "That's why you told me about Harlan? You thought I would warn him?" "He was white, and his heart was probably very black," the old man shrugged. "But he was still a man. The Wendigo, that is something else." "You know, Henry, if my grandmother hadn't been one of the people, I'd probably wonder about all this Wendigo business." "If your grandmother hadn't been one of the people, you would probably not be so smart," the old man said with a calm flourish of smoke. Cork thanked Malou for the soup and put on his coat to leave. At the door, the old man studied him hard. "This anger in your eyes, is it because you are hunting the Wendigo?" "I don't know what it is I'm hunting, Henry." Malou nodded thoughtfully, still looking keenly at Cork. The Wendigo was a man once. His heart was not always ice. What makes a man's heart turn to ice? I would think about that, and I would think about how to fight the Wendigo. I thought you told me I wasn't the one to fight the Wendigo. Malou shrugged. I'm old. I'm not right as much as I used to be. Often enough, Henry, Cork replied. From Malou's he started across the ice, heading back toward town. A mile to the east he could see the inlet where Molly's sauna stood. He slowed and stopped, then turned in that direction. When she didn't answer his knock, he let himself in with the key on the nail under the steps. The cabin was cool. Molly kept it that way. Lately, whenever they'd crawled into bed, the sheets were cold at first, and for the first few minutes they simply held each other while the bedding warmed around them. Cork walked the quiet cabin, taking in the silent disarray of Molly's life. The Sunday paper was folded on the coffee table near the big stone fireplace in the main room. On the floor beside a hand-sewn pillow sat an empty cup with a used tea bag in the saucer, and next to it, lying face down, a book called The Tao of Loving. A sweater lay thrown over the back of her rocking chair. He walked up the stairs. In the bathroom, her cosmetics were scattered about the counter next to the sink. The lid was still off the Noxema. Hairbrushes and combs stood together in a small clay pot she'd made herself in an art class at the community college. In the bedroom, the bed had been hastily made. Cork heard the sound of her old sob coming down the lane. He headed downstairs and stepped into the kitchen as she came in the back door. Molly glanced at him coldly and hung her coat. "What are you doing here?" "I let myself in." She brushed past him and went to the refrigerator. She took out a carton of cherry yogurt and grabbed a spoon from the drawer. She wore the jeans and the taupe sweater she'd waitressed in all morning. There was a spot of mustard on her right sleeve. "You look good," he said. "What did you expect, that I'd fall apart?" She gave him a brief appraisal. "You look like a bully just stole your lunch." "About yesterday," he said cautiously. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt you." Molly pulled the lid off the yogurt and took a spoonful. "Why are you here?" Cork shoved his hands into the pockets of his coat and stared at the scarred wooden floor. "I need to talk to someone." "Find someone else." She turned her back to him and walked to the table. "There isn't anyone else," he said. "I've lived here almost my whole life, and I've got no one to talk to." She slid a chair out with her foot and sat down heavily. "Try your wife." "She's in love with someone else." "I could have told you that." Cork stared at her, bewildered. "You know, Cork, for a smart man, you're pretty stupid sometimes." "You knew?" "I suspected." Cork felt fuzzy and a little numb, as if something were blocking the flow of blood to his brain. "How?" "A feeling from the things you told me." "Christ, I feel like such a fool." "You're not the first." She considered him a moment, then put down the yogurt. "Would you like some tea? Do you still have that whiskey?" "Ginseng will be better for you." She went to the cupboard. "Who is he?" "Sandy Parent." "Is she planning on going with him to Washington?" "She'd never do that," Cork said. "She'd never take the kids away." Molly shrugged. "Love makes people do strange things. I ought to know." Cork turned around and stared out the window. Snow was still falling, still very lightly. It would have been lovely if he hadn't felt so bad. "I heard about Harlan Litton," Molly said. She moved to the stove for the kettle. "It didn't sound pretty." "It wasn't." "Any idea who killed him?" "Not yet." He watched her familiar movements, but she was a distant figure now, on the far side of a chasm he'd created. "I don't think I'll stay for the tea." "Cork," she said quickly as he turned to the door. I didn't say anything about Joe because I didn't want you to think I was trying to turn you against her. I didn't want you to think I was just some sort of desperate husband-stealing bitch. I would never think that about you. You were the best thing in my life, Molly." She fisted her hand on her hip and shot back. "Somehow I missed that part in our discussion yesterday." "Yesterday wasn't about you. I hoped I could save my children from, I don't know, the inevitable. Children survive a lot, Cork. You and I both know that." "I guess we do." They fell quiet. Cork wanted to say he loved her. He wanted to ask her to forgive him. He wanted to lay his head against her breast and weep into her warm flesh and feel as connected to someone as he'd felt the night the grief passed through him when he hunted the big bear with Sam Wintermoon. Molly crossed her arms and seemed to read his thoughts. "I told you there wasn't a swinging door here, Cork. I meant it." "I understand." "I don't think you do. You hurt me. You were ready to cut me out of your life like I was a rotten spot on an otherwise perfect apple." He looked at the floor. "I've got no apple now. Only applesauce." He glanced at her face. If there was a smile anywhere near, she hid it well. "You've always made me laugh, Cork. That's not what I want now." "What do you want?" "To feel needed. To feel that you need me as much as you need air to breathe. I'm worth that." She pointed toward the cold outside. "Go on. Take some time to think about it." He didn't need any time. Already he couldn't breathe. But he turned the knob anyway, because it was what Molly wanted, and he walked out the door. Chapter 25. In the language of the Anishinaabe, December was called Manadu Gizasuns, the month of small spirits. It was late afternoon by the time he entered the limits of Aurora, December 20th, one day away from the shortest, darkest day of the year. The forecast was for continued snow, heavier during the evening, additional accumulations of up to 3 inches by morning. Cork wished there was a forecast for his spirit. He felt the dark and the cold penetrating deep in him. He wondered when there would be warmth again, when there would be light. He also wondered if his ribs would ever stop hurting. He parked in front of Sam's place and stood a moment looking through falling snow at the geese who were bound to their small world of open water. In a strange way, he figured he knew what that was like, to have the world close down around you. He took his keys and moved to the door. It was already unlocked. He was careful not to look at the windows and wondered if even now he was being watched. He turned away casually, as if he'd changed his mind naturally, and he walked to the side of the Quonset hut. Then he edged to the kitchen window that was covered with cardboard. He listened for a minute. Inside, just a couple of feet from his head, a cupboard door squeaked. They'd looked for something after the judge was killed. Now Litton was dead. Were they looking this time for something Litton had? He tried to think of some plan, some way of trapping them. Then he heard glass shatter inside. The sound of the breaking broke something in Cork. It was like the ripping of a membrane, a thin sheathing that had contained his outrage and his anger. His whole body drew taut, and a bitter taste flooded his mouth. His home was being violated again. His whole life was being violated. He headed to the Bronco, took out the tire iron, and stepped to the front door. He took a deep, painful breath, clenched his teeth, kicked open the door, and rushed them. Jenny crouched in the kitchen near the sink, picking up pieces of a broken glass. She cried out when Cork came at her, and she fell back, holding her arms up to protect herself. Cork stood over her with the tire iron raised. "What are you doing here?" he asked, hoarse with the rage that still ran in his blood, and with the pain that knifed at him from his ribs. I... She stammered. Her eyes were full of terror. "I just wanted to help clean up." Cork lowered the iron and held his side. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm sorry I scared you. You had me scared, too." He glanced around. The place had been picked up. Everything was in order. Dishes sat dripping in the rack by the sink. White suds clung to Jenny's hands. "Are you all right, Dad?" she asked, seeing how he held himself. "Fine. Here, let me help you." He knelt carefully and picked up the last pieces of the broken water glass and dropped them into the garbage can under the sink. "The place looks great. You've been here a while." She dried her hands on a dish towel. "I heard about the man who was killed last night. I'm scared for you, Dad." "There's no reason to be, Jenny." She stared at him. She had her mother's blue eyes, and normally her mother's calm self-assuredness reflected in them. But her eyes were afraid now. "Somebody killed him," she pointed out, "and shot at you." That was a point Cork couldn't argue. Still, he smiled reassuringly. "I'm sure I'm safe." Jenny leaned against the counter, still watching him with her frightened blue eyes. "What's a Wendigo?" "Where'd you hear about that?" "Around. What is it?" "A story. That's all it is, just a story." Jenny finally looked down, studying her hands that were raw and red from the hot dishwater. "I want to stay here with you." "Here?" He reached out and held her. "I'm flattered, honey, but I don't think that's such a good idea." "Why not?" "For one thing, I'm not the cook your Aunt Rose is. I'm used to eating my own bad cooking, but I wouldn't take the chance of poisoning you." "I'm serious." "Okay, let's sit down." He nodded toward the 2 chairs at the small kitchen table. He saw that Jenny had made a fruit bowl as a centerpiece. Cork had always kept the salt and pepper shakers there. He liked the colorful touch of the fruit. "I'll level with you," he said, taking her hands in his. "I'm concerned about Stevie and Ann. Things are rough enough for them with me gone. They look to you for a lot." "I don't care." "I know they're not your responsibility, but I need your help, Jenny. I need you to stay with your mom, to work to keep things together as much as you can. It's probably not a fair thing to ask, but I'm asking." Her eyes were no longer afraid, but they seemed full of hurt, and their hurt pained him deeply. "Things won't ever be like they used to, will they?" Jenny searched his face for the truth. "No." He looked at his hands. Big hands. How useless a man's hands were, he thought, when it came to fixing the important things. "Things fall apart," she said in a small voice. "The center will not hold." He gave her a questioning look. "Yates," she explained. "W.B." "All the king's horses and all the king's men," he replied. "Dumpty, H." Although a tear crawled down one cheek like a small snail, she smiled. "By the way," she said, taking care of the tear with a swipe of her finger, "there's a message on your answering machine." "You listened?" She gave him an innocent little shrug. "What did it say?" "You can have your gun back." He dropped Jenny off at home, then stopped by the sheriff's office to retrieve his revolver. While he was there, he used the payphone to call the casino. "I'd like to speak with Russell Blackwater, please. Tell him it's Corcoran O'Connor." He waited a full minute before Blackwater came on the line. "What do you want, O'Connor?" Blackwater's tone wasn't civil at all. "We need to talk." "About what? Something of concern to us both?" "And what's that?" "The Wendigo," Cork said. Russell Blackwater's office was decorated with Native American art. On the walls were hung a series of idealized paintings by William Westskye, a Shinob out of Canada, showing pristine forests and lakes with the faint faces of the people woven into the clouds, watching the land below like good overseers. On Blackwater's desk stood a dark wood sculpture depicting a member of the Grand Medicine Society lifting the pipe in the pipe dance of peace. The desk was big, dark red wood. The surface wore a lustrous shine, and the Madewa wind was reflected perfectly below himself, as if offering the pipe to the underworld. Running the length of the back wall of the office was a tinted window overlooking the gambling floor. Blackwater was standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking down at the action. He wore an expensive gray suit, white shirt, blue tie. "Busy night," Cork observed. "A good night," Blackwater said. "For those who win." "The people win," Blackwater said, turning fully to Cork. "What do you want, O'Connor?" Cork sat down in a big brown leather chair. He settled back and crossed his legs. "Harlan Litton was killed last night." "I know. Can't say I'm sorry." "Did you also know that Henry Malou heard the Wendigo call Litton's name?" Blackwater shrugged as if it made no difference one way or the other. "Malou's an old man. The things old men hear and see can't always be trusted." "Henry was here the night the judge was killed." "So? He came to warn you. He heard the Wendigo call your name, too." Blackwater looked unconcerned. "I'm a modern shinob. Tell me the legislature is monkeying with the gambling laws and I'll be nervous, but I'm not afraid of an old myth." Cork stared pointedly at Blackwater, then shook his head in a disappointed way. "I never thought I'd see you looking so much like a businessman, Russell. I remember you wearing deerskin during the Trail of Tears march on Washington." "I'm still marching," Blackwater insisted. "The clothes don't make any difference." "I was at Sandy Parent's house the other day, after the judge's memorial service. Didn't see you there." "What are you getting at?" "But I understand Sandy Parent was at the funeral of your father. What do you make of that? You work with these people. You're making these people rich. You show them respect, but do they reciprocate?" "As I understand it, Sandy Parent went out of his way to make sure a lot of people would feel comfortable being at his father's memorial service. But he didn't extend the courtesy to you, did he?" "Like an invitation?" Blackwater said with sarcasm. "Whatever. What makes you think I'd want to go?" "I don't know," Cork said. He fingered the sculpture of the Medewawin on Blackwater's desk, ran his hand casually down the sleek, polished wood. "An invitation at least would be nice. The white man and the red man in enterprise together, you know, hunting the new buffalo like brothers." Although Russell Blackwater held very still, Cork saw the tendons in his neck go taut. His eyes changed too in the way they regarded Cork, watching him closely. His voice was hard, the words tense and spoken carefully. "Before this casino was built, unemployment on the reservation was 70%. Nearly a quarter of our families were below poverty level. 2 years ago, 1 Anishinaabe student graduated from Aurora High School. 10 others dropped out. This year, 4 will graduate, and no one's dropped out. We have a free health clinic on the drawing board that will be staffed by the people. We'll have a real school soon. We started looking at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation program to be run by us, not by the public health service." He sat up rigidly with his fingers digging into the padded arms of his chair. "That's what I wanted from this enterprise, not an invitation to white men's homes." Cork nodded and held up his hands in surrender. "Okay by me. Just making a comment. By the way, why don't you unbutton your coat? Looks a little uncomfortable to me." "My coat's fine." "You always carry a piece these days?" Blackwater tugged at his suit coat, straightening the way it fell over his chest and the shoulder holster he was wearing. "When I'm working, it's licensed." "Not thinking of shooting an old myth, are you?" Cork got up and headed for the door. "By the way, the sheriff's probably going to want to know where you were when Litton was shot." "Why?" "Because I intend to tell him to ask." "Night, Russell." Chapter 26. The judge's estate occupied the whole tip of North Point. The property was shaped roughly like a fingernail, and along the shoreline grew a wall of tall pines. Cork guided the Bronco off the ice through a gap between the boathouse and the trees, and parked where the vehicle couldn't be seen. He got out and waded up the steep slope of the grounds toward the house. In the stillness, he could hear the steady whine of a snowmobile cutting across the ice, heading back toward Aurora from one of the many ice huts on the lake. He looked back, but the darkness and the gentle snowfall kept him from seeing anything. The patio doors were locked, but Cork was surprised to discover that a small pane in the mullioned window of the kitchen door had been broken, and the door was unlocked. Carefully, he pushed it open. From inside came a startling clatter. He stepped hurriedly into the kitchen and found that he'd knocked over a brown paper bag full of empty aluminum cans that appeared to have been saved for recycling. The kitchen smelled of garbage souring somewhere out of sight. In the living room, the curtains were open, letting in a pale white light from the snow outside. The house was absolutely still and very cool. He had only a vague idea of what he was looking for. The judge hadn't been a tremendously charismatic or beloved man, but he had nonetheless been a powerful political figure in the Iron Range. Power had many sources besides charisma. Money was one. Although Robert Parent had been a wealthy man, Cork figured it would have taken a hell of a lot more than even the judge had to maintain his hold on a population as independent as that of the Iron Range. Power also came from leverage. The bloody folder with the judge's doodling all over the cover, the folder that held such graphic evidence of Joe's infidelity, that was one kind of leverage, and was certainly in keeping with the character of the judge. It was entirely possible that the judge's death had something to do with that kind of leverage. Cork crept down the short hallway to the study. The curtains were closed and the room quite dark. He made his way to the desk and fumbled to turn on the lamp. When the light came on, he heard a discreet cough behind him. He turned quickly and found himself staring across the room at Wally Shawno, who stood in front of a wall lined with bookshelves. "Evening, Cork," Shawno said. In one hand he held a flashlight. In the other was a gun, pointed directly at Cork. Stacks of books pulled from the shelves lay on the floor at Shawno's feet. "Library closed?" Cork asked. Shawno glanced down at the books, but didn't smile. Cork jabbed his thumb over his shoulder in the direction of the kitchen. "Windows broken. Wasn't me." "I know," Shawno said. "You don't seem surprised to see me." "It's been a tough week. Not much surprises me now." "What are you doing here, Wally?" "Police quarantine. I'm allowed here. The real question is, what are you doing here?" Cork glanced around the room. "Lights off, bookshelves ransacked, and you even have a thermos of coffee. What's going on, Wally?" Shawno narrowed his eyes severely. "I look at things on the surface, and what I see is you, Cork. The judge is dead, and there you are. Litton's killed, and there you are again. On the surface, looks like I ought to suspect you like hell." "Do you really think I killed those men?" "Doesn't matter what I think. A man can always be wrong in his thinking. I try to look at the facts." He holstered his gun. "I sent Ed out this afternoon to check on your story about Henry Malou and that, what did you call it? Wendigo." "Yeah, that. Old Malou told Ed he didn't know what the hell you were talking about." Cork relaxed against the judge's big desk. "That doesn't surprise me. Ed's white." "The old man lied?" "Sure. If you were crazy enough to indict me, he'd tell the truth. In the meantime, there's no reason. He knows you just look at him like he was goofy." "Or like maybe he had something to do with killing Litton," Shawno suggested. I'd consider a lot of other people before I'd consider him, Cork replied. Shawno took a deep breath and reached down toward the floor for his steel thermos and poured himself some hot coffee. You told me a lot of stories without much of anything to back them up. The break-in at your place, the condition of the judge's body, somebody shooting at you out at Litton's. They weren't stories, Wally. Shawno took a sip of his coffee, drawing his throat tight against the heat. You're a hard man to disbelieve. He nodded in the direction of the kitchen. I came here the night after the judge died to look things over for myself, see if I could find anything we missed. I surprised somebody coming in the side door. Don't know who. They got away. I've been here a lot since then, checking to make sure things stay secure, and still looking for anything that might support your claim about the judge's body being moved. Cork looked down at the books pulled from the shelves. Find anything there? Shawno set his coffee on an empty shelf and walked to the big desk. The mess of the judge's death hadn't been cleaned away. The Minnesota map on the wall was still splattered with blood, and bits of what once had been a complex and devious brain. Traces of blood streaked the wall toward a pooling on the floor. It had all gone brown now, clotted over. Shawno stepped carefully. He slid open and then shut drawer after drawer in frustration. I'm just about down to checking the cobwebs in the corners. Nothing, Cork. Not a gall darn thing anywhere. If someone moved the judge, they did a pretty good job of covering up after themselves and covering up the reason why. He arched his back, stretching in a tired way. I got my hands so full at the moment I can't sleep at all. I've posted Cy Borkman over to Harlan Litton's cabin nights to make sure nothing's disturbed there. He's pissed about that. Arletta's staying with her sister. She's got it in her head I've deserted her and taken the kids somewhere. Hell, Hanover's on my ass. Says I'm just another example of incompetent, interfering law enforcement. It strikes me that man just doesn't like cops. Cork, I know there's something going on in Aurora. I just can't get a handle on what it is. Wally Shawno looked straight at him with his honest gray eyes that were sunk deep with exhaustion. And you still haven't told me what you're doing here. Cork heard the sound of a snowmobile again, closer this time, cutting along the ice around North Point. It sounded small and distant like a pesky mosquito. He thought about the folder with Joe's name on it, the one that had first belonged to the judge, and didn't know how to tell a man, Shawno or anybody else, what was in it. He couldn't even be sure there was any significance in the folder having been in the judge's hands at one time. Finally he said, pretty much the same reason you are, Wally, to see about the judge's body being moved. You're sure that's it? As sure as I am of anything. Shawno grunted unhappily. You'd best leave this to me. I'm the one on the payroll. Cork left the study and headed down the hallway with Shawno following. At the staircase, Shawno halted and said, Better go out the front. Sounds like you already made a mess of the kitchen back there. Close the door on your way out. Me, I've got to take a good long piss. Cork took in the empty house where the feel of death was as real as any of the furnishings. Be careful, Wally, he cautioned. Nothing to it. I've been pissing all my life. Shawno managed to grin. Cork stepped out the front door. The snow was falling harder, and he could barely see beyond the hedges that edged the front of the estate. Slowly, he made his way around the house down the slope of the grounds to the Bronco. But he didn't get in right away. The air was still, the snow tumbling straight down in huge, beautiful flakes. He lit a cigarette and turned his face upwards so that the snow settled cold on his forehead and cheeks and melted there. He smoked and thought about truth. He'd learned early not to invest a lot of emotion in thinking about the truth in a crime. As a cop, he'd gathered evidence that had been used to guess at the truth. But in the end, responsibility for assembling the pieces and nailing truth to the wall was in the hands of others, lawyers, judges, and juries. Truth became a democratic process, the will of 12. He'd been burned when he cared too deeply. As a result, he'd trained himself to remain a little distant in his emotional involvement on a case. In the end, the outcome was out of his hands, and to allow himself to believe too strongly in the absoluteness of a thing he couldn't control was useless. He felt different now, desperate in a way. This time he had to hold the truth in his own hands like a beating heart. In the stillness, 2 gunshots came from the house, 2 clear pops like kernels of corn. Cork threw down his cigarette, reached into the glove box of his Bronco, and drew out the revolver he'd picked up earlier at the sheriff's office. He started around the boathouse and up the backyard at a dead run, stumbling in the deep snow. When he reached the door to the kitchen, he stopped. It was wide open. He hesitated before plunging into the dark of the house, and he listened. Deep inside, someone swore painfully. "Wally?" he called. "Damn it, Cork!" Shawno hollered. Cork ran in, knocking cans across the kitchen floor. Shawno sat at the bottom of the stairs, holding his right thigh with both hands. Cork could see the dark blood welling up, spilling between Shawno's fingers. "Bastard sneaked up," Shawno said through clenched teeth. "I'll call you in." Cork turned quickly to the phone on the stand beside the banister. "No, go after him. I'll call myself in. Go on before he's away clean." Cork hesitated a moment. "Go on, damn you, I'm not dying." Cork dashed back out the kitchen door. Tracks in the snow led toward the row of pine trees that lined the northern shore of the estate. Before he could follow, the rough cough of a snowmobile engine trying to turn over came from beyond the trees. Cork ran for the Bronco. As he opened the door, he heard the engine of the snowmobile leap into a steady whine. He didn't have much time. If the snowmobile headed north across the lake toward National Forest land, he'd probably lose it. He would have too great a head start, and once it hit the trails in the woods, he wouldn't be able to follow anyway. But he was lucky. Just as he turned the key in the Bronco, the dark shape of the little machine shot past on the ice behind the boathouse, heading toward Aurora. The snowmobile was running with its headlights on, but Cork drove the Bronco dark. The snowmobile headed straight for town with Cork less than 50 yards behind and gaining. If his luck held, he could close the gap completely before the driver of the snowmobile was even aware he was being followed. His luck didn't hold. When he was within 30 yards, the headlights of the little machine went dark, and the snowmobile suddenly tunneled into the snowy night and was lost to him. He switched on his own headlights, but it was too late. The snowmobile was nowhere to be seen. He braked, and the Bronco spun on the ice. It did a full 360 degrees before it came to a stop. Cork rolled his window down and listened. He heard the whine of the snowmobile cutting east, heading toward the reservation, the nearest forest land, where thick woods would swallow it quickly. Cork turned the Bronco in that direction. He kicked his lights up to high beam. The flurry of snowflakes flew at him like a swarm of white moths. He wanted to floor the accelerator, but he was heading into a section of the lake popular with ice fishermen, and he didn't want to risk a collision with a shanty. He kept his window rolled down and leaned his head out. Although the wind rushed at him with a dull roar, he could still hear ahead of him the persistent high pitch of the snowmobile feverishly speeding away. Then he heard something else, the sound of impact. Splintering wood followed by the thumping of heavy metal, and finally, silence. He slowed and listened. The night on the lake had become still again, deceptively peaceful. He crept the Bronco ahead. Within a minute, his lights picked up the wreckage of a small shanty that lay on its side amid fragments of splintered boards. One wall was caved in, a ragged hole torn open. Cork couldn't see the snowmobile, but from the line of scattered debris, he could guess the trajectory it must have taken after glancing off the shanty. He turned the Bronco slowly until the headlights swung onto the snowmobile. It was standing upright, as if it had simply been parked. Vehicular accidents were like that sometimes. A car could flip 2 or 3 times and come to rest on its wheels as if nothing had happened. The driver of the snowmobile was nowhere to be seen. Cork gripped the .38 and stepped out. He looked carefully around, saw no one, listened, and heard only the distant, steady thrum behind him of a freight train moving slowly through Aurora. He'd taken a few cautious steps toward the snowmobile when a figure in goggles and a green parka popped up from behind the machine, laid an arm across the hood, and pulled off 2 rounds before Cork could move. The headlight beside him exploded, and he felt a numbing blow to his right hand. He hit the snow and rolled under the Bronco. His hand had no feeling, and it no longer held the revolver. The green parka let loose another round. Cork heard the bullet chisel into the ice near the rear tire. He reached out and swept through the snow with his left hand, desperately searching for the gun. Illuminated in the beam of the remaining headlight, the green parka straddled the snowmobile again. The engine kicked over twice, then caught. The machine swung out of the light, following an arc into the darkness that would take it back toward Aurora. Cork scrambled from under the Bronco. He wanted to find his gun, but knew it would take precious time. He jumped back in behind the wheel and cried out when he wrapped his right hand around the knob of the gear shift. In the glow from his dashboard lights, he could see something protruding from the glove on his hand between his thumb and index finger. He gave a quick, agonizing jerk and pulled out a jagged piece of glass 2 inches long. He hadn't been hit by the round, but by a chunk of the shattered headlight. Although his glove was soaked with blood, he found he could manage with the glass fragment out. Using the heel of his hand, he pushed the Bronco into gear, swung the vehicle around, and headed in pursuit of the green parka. In the chaos of the chase, Cork had lost a feel for exactly where on the lake he was. The snow curtained the shoreline, and he had nothing from which to get his bearings. He knew he was headed in the direction of Aurora, but he had only a general sense of distance. Although he wanted desperately to catch the snowmobile, he resisted the temptation to bear down on the accelerator. The near disaster with the ice hut had been a resounding caution against blind speed. Also, his luck had returned in a way. In the collision, the snowmobile had sprung an oil leak and was leaving a clear black trail for Cork to follow across the lake. He was intent on the trail of oil when out of the corner of his eye he caught a flash of orange at the far right fringe of his headlight beam. He realized it was one of the signs warning of open water ahead, and he pumped his brakes, fighting to keep from sliding into an uncontrolled spin as he attempted to turn the Bronco. He felt the wheels drift over the ice as the vehicle slid sideways. A brief panic vision came to him of the Bronco gliding unchecked off the ice and plunging into the black depths of Iron Lake. He eased the wheel into the spin and managed to regain control. From behind the curtain of falling snow ahead, the blackness of the open water came at him like a gaping mouth. He continued to slow and to bring the Bronco around. Then he heard the ice groan and crack beneath him. Steadily, he pushed down on the accelerator, running parallel for a moment to the open water, trying to keep the weight of the Bronco moving ahead of the breaking ice. His right hand ached, but he held tight and carefully brought the wheel around until he was moving back to safety. He made a wide, full circle. When he came across the black train of oil, he centered it in the beam of the headlight, illuminating the stretch of ice between him and the open water. He killed the engine and got out. He could hear wild flailing in the water ahead. From the glove compartment, he grabbed a flashlight. He stopped well back from the edge of the ice. Using the flashlight, he located the snowmobile that appeared to have skipped 20 yards over the surface of the water before it stopped and began to sink. The hood was still above water, the green parka clinging to it desperately. Cork spun around and began to run, cutting the darkness right and left with the beam of his flashlight. He found what he was looking for, a safety station. He pulled the white life ring loose and the loops of yellow rope. Then he ran back. The green parka was still holding to the hood of the snowmobile, although there was not much left above water. Cork unlooped the rope. He tried grasping the ring with his right hand, but the wound from the glass chunk hurt too much. He switched it to his left, brought it back, and heaved it. This time the pain was in his ribs. The ring fell several yards short and to the right. "Swim for it," Cork yelled. The green parka started for the ring, but stopped inexplicably and grabbed again for the snowmobile. Cork hauled in the rope. He held the ring in his right hand this time and chucked it underhand, crying out as the pain knifed into him. The ring arched and fell within easy reach of the figure in the water. The green parka grabbed the ring just as the snowmobile slid from sight. Cork began to draw in the rope, hand over hand, but something was wrong. Although it hurt like hell to pull, he shouldn't have felt much resistance. Yet tug as he might, he couldn't budge the green parka from the spot where the snowmobile had gone under. Then, to his shock, he felt the line slipping from his grasp. Despite his tortured ribs, he looped the rope around his own body. The pull at the other end began to drag him toward the water. He was confused. The life ring should have come easily. But it was as if Cork were in a battle with something that wanted the green parka more than he did. Vainly he dug at the ice with his heels. When he looked up, he saw that the green parka was grasping the ring desperately, beating at the water, and was still being dragged inexorably under. Cork strained against the rope as he was inched nearer and nearer the edge. He heard the thin ice crack under his weight and knew that in a moment the water would have him too. He let go. The green parka slid from sight, swallowed by the lake as if by a hungry giant. The rope continued to jerk for another minute, and then it was still. Cork's right hand throbbed. His ribs hurt so much that he could barely breathe. He realized he was shivering, although he wasn't cold. He could hear the wail of sirens somewhere off to his right. Wally Shauna was getting help. He stared at the black water. White flakes of snow drifted down onto the surface and melted. The lake looked so calm, so peaceful, as if swallowing a man was nothing. The flashing lights brought out a lot of spectators from town. They gathered along the shoreline and watched as if it were an event. Cork spotted Sandy Parent speaking with some of the deputies and nodding authoritatively as they gestured toward the open water. Their eyes met briefly, coldly. Then Parent left. Cork refused to leave until the divers from the fire department had brought the body up. Near midnight, they hauled it dripping onto the ice and laid it in the glare of the floodlights that had been set up at safe distance from the perimeter of the water. The diver said they had to cut a shoe free. The lace had become entangled in the track of the snowmobile. Although the body had been in the water more than an hour, standard procedure required the paramedics to attempt revival. They pumped on his chest and tried administering oxygen, but even a blind man could see that their efforts were useless. The face of the man in the green parka was a lighter color than Cork had ever believed it could be, and maybe more peaceful. Russell Blackwater, the man with the hungry hunter's eyes, would hunt the earth no more. Chapter 27. He slept late, slept through the ringing of the telephone, thought he heard a knocking at the door, and slept through that too. It was cold in the Quonset hut, but warm under his blanket, and he didn't want to leave that very small place where he curled for safety. Finally, the deep, ceaseless throbbing of his hand forced him to get up. He took a couple of the extra-strength ibuprofen the resident on duty at the community hospital emergency ward had given him when he stitched up his hand. The doctor had also x-rayed the place along Cork's ribs where his skin had turned a deep, brooding purple. Nothing broken. In the bathroom, he studied himself in the mirror. He looked old, a decade older than a week before. His eyes were dark-circled, his face puffy. There seemed to be a brutish aspect in his appearance that he'd never recognized before, and he felt a cold, abiding despair sunk all the way to his bones. Who was this man staring at him? What was he becoming? It was late morning when he stepped outside. Snow no longer fell, but the sky was heavily overcast. A wind blew across the lake, harsh and steady, and tore at the edges of a note he found tacked to his door. "Call me." It was signed by Father Tom Griffin. Cork checked the headlight that had been shattered by the bullet from Blackwater's gun. It would have to be fixed, but he wasn't in any hurry. He went to the storage shed and hauled out his auger and ice spud. He loaded them in the back of the Bronco, and he put his fishing gear there too. He went once more into Sam's place to fill a bucket with grain, and then he headed down to the lake. The geese were gone. After last night, that didn't surprise him. He stood a moment, looking across the choppy gray water. There'd been something welcoming about it when the geese were there. Now the open water seemed only menacing. He emptied the bucket and left it in the snow. He hated hospitals. He couldn't get beyond the idea of them representing death. In his experience, people went to the hospital to die. His father had died in a hospital with Cork helpless beside him. He hated the sinister cleanliness of their look and smell, the hush of them as if holding a big, insidious secret. In so many ways, the scent of burning cedar and sage and the chant of the Medewawin seemed more real and hopeful. Wally Shawno was no longer in the Aurora Community Hospital. Cork spoke with a resident, a young man named Dr. Furman, the same one who'd stitched up Cork's hand and who'd been on duty since early morning. He looked even more tired than Cork. Shawno had checked himself out several hours ago against the doctor's advice. The gunshot wound was clean, no bone or artery hit, but Dr. Furman would have liked a day or so for observation anyway. The doctor said that a little before noon, Sigurd Nelson visited Shawno, and a short time later the sheriff told the station nurse he was leaving. Dr. Furman had come down and argued with him. "He's a grown man, he can make his own decisions." The exhausted resident shrugged. "He signed the waiver. My hands are clean." Cork called the sheriff's office from a hospital payphone. Shawno was there. "Get over here," the sheriff said, sounding tired but pretty excited for a man with a hole recently torn through his leg. "I've got something you'll want to see." Sandy Parent sat in a chair near Shawno's desk. He looked at Cork with a blank expression. Cork returned the look in kind. "Hope you don't mind if I don't get up, Cork," Shawno said with a big grin and a nod toward his leg, which was hidden by the desk. Leaning against the wall directly behind him was a pair of crutches. "Come on in. Hang up your coat." "How's the leg feel?" Cork asked. "I'm on painkiller right now, so not so bad. The doctor said I'd have a couple of scars, but nothing to worry about." "Voters like scars on their lawmen," Cork said. Shawno gave an appreciative laugh. Cork said, "Those painkillers sure seem to help your humor, Wally." "It's not the painkillers. I think I'm just about ready to close the book on what's been going on around here. It's pretty simple in the end." Cork sat in an old wooden chair near the window. He crossed his legs and looked at the two men. He saw Shawno's eyes shift for the briefest instant toward a small, white, three-drawer filing cabinet sitting on the floor near Parent. It was out of place with the tall, green cabinet in which the sheriff kept the regular files. "Any of your people find my .38 last night out where Blackwater collided with the ice hut?" Cork asked. "I don't know. Check with the desk officer on your way out." Shawno seemed irritated that Cork had jumped to a different track suddenly, but the pleased look came back to him as he went on. "I found something very interesting this morning, a folder Harlan Litton had that I think explains everything." "One file," Cork considered. "And it explains everything?" "Have a look for yourself," Shawno said. He picked up a manila folder in front of him and offered it to Cork. The typewritten name on the folder read, Blackwater R. Inside were several pages of computer printout with figures and money amounts arranged under headings and columns that clearly dealt with the Chippewa Grand Casino. In several places, the figures in the columns had been highlighted with a yellow marker. Midway through the pages, Cork glanced up, questioningly. "I know, they don't look like much," Shawno admitted. "I wasn't sure about them either, so I asked Sandy here to take a look, considering his association with the casino." Cork swung his gaze over to Parent. "It doesn't take a genius," Parent said, "to see that the figures have been juggled. A good accountant would spot it eventually, or someone who knows the casino operation well, like Dad or me." "Embezzlement?" Cork asked. Parent nodded. "From just the cursory look I took, I'd say at least 100,000. A complete audit will probably turn up a lot more." "How did he expect to get away with it?" Cork asked, "if you saw it right off." "Regulations regarding Indian-run casinos are extremely lax. An audit wouldn't necessarily take place for years. We tried to negotiate a contract with the Iron Lake Band that would give management responsibility to Great North, because we have all the business expertise they need. They chose to manage it themselves, with Russell Blackwater at the helm. This is the result." Parent shook his head disdainfully. "How'd Litton get hold of this report?" Parent shrugged. "Paid off someone in the business office. It wouldn't be that hard." Shawno sat back in his chair, looking pleased. "I told you the ATF was interested in Litton and the Minnesota Civilian Brigade. They believed money had become suddenly available to finance arms. I figure Litton was blackmailing Blackwater. Sure would be a good way to come by lots of untraceable income." "So you think Blackwater killed Litton to end the blackmail?" Cork said. "I think once Jack the Ripper was out of the way, it looked like a piece of cake to Blackwater. If the Ripper had still been alive, maybe Litton would be too." The accusation in Shawno's words wasn't wasted on Cork. "I'm taking Cy Borkman off his surveillance of Litton's cabin," Shawno went on. "He'll be happy he can sleep at home nights. Maybe I can sleep now too." Parent stood up and put on his coat. "If you don't need me anymore, I'd like to get back to the office. I think I've done what I can on all this. Thanks for your help, Sandy. I'll be in touch." Parent offered Cork a cool nod in parting. "Crazy world, Cork," Wally Shawno observed after Parent was gone. He swiveled in his chair, grimaced a little, and held his leg a moment. Cork saw the distortion under his pants that was the thick rounding of bandages about his thigh. "Crazy world," Shawno went on. "But it makes a lot more sense to me now than it did yesterday." "Seems that way," Cork said. "Seems?" Shawno shot him an unpleasant look. "What do you mean by that?" "Where'd you get this folder, Wally?" "Like I said, Litton had it." "Where?" "Does that matter?" "It might." "Did Sigurd bring you the file?" "Sigurd?" "They told me at the hospital our coroner visited you this morning. You left right after. Did he bring you the file?" "In a manner of speaking." He reached into his desk drawer and brought out a key that he handed to Cork. "He brought me that." The key was silver with Aurora U-Store engraved on the head along with the number 213. He found it on Litton when he took a look at the body in his official capacity. My men must have missed it. "So you went over and found the shed that fit the key?" "Exactly. The file was there." "All by itself? Just waiting for you to pick it up?" "No, I had to do some digging. Litton had a lot of equipment in the shed, a slew of eavesdropping equipment, fancy camera apparatus. And that," Cork pointed toward the white filing cabinet he'd noticed earlier. "And that," Shawno admitted. "Mind if I look at it?" The sheriff considered it a moment. "I don't see why not. Maybe it'll help you understand my dilemma." Cork opened the top drawer. It was full of folders like the one on Russell Blackwater. He recognized many of the names on the folder labels. "Try the middle drawer, midway back," Shawno suggested. Cork checked the drawer, found a folder marked O'Connor, C. He pulled it out. It was thin. Inside were a couple of photographs, enlarged, of Molly and him embracing naked on the shore by her sauna. Like the photos of Joe and Parent, they'd been taken from somewhere out on the lake at night. Shawno rocked back carefully. You know, the equipment in Litton's unit at the Aurora youth store was pretty sophisticated stuff. A lot of those files have photographs more or less like those. I'm sure they were shot by Harlan Litton. All of the subjects have been caught in some indiscretion, things the folks here in Aurora would love to chew on for a while, but nothing really criminal so far as I've been able to see. Blackwater's file was different. You think Litton was blackmailing all these people? Was he blackmailing you? No. Then he probably wasn't. Kept it limited to where he could make the most with the least difficulty. Blackwater got a lot from his embezzling, enough to share easily with Harlan Litton. You really think Litton was smart enough to figure out the thing with Blackwater in the casino? Look at those files, Cork. The man was used to nosing through other people's crap. A man like that probably knows where to look for the worst. Cork had to agree. Litton was just that kind of man. What do you think about Blackwater? What was he doing at the judge's? Shawno's hand instinctively sought out his bandaged leg and felt it gently. I read your statement this morning. You told Blackwater last night at the casino that you were going to have me check out his whereabouts on the night Litton was killed. I think Blackwater followed you. I think he planned to kill you to keep from putting me onto him. He saw you go in the side door. He just didn't see you go out the front. Bastard shot me by mistake. I suppose I ought to thank you then, Cork said. You probably saved my life. Shawno waved it off. Getting things back to normal around here is all I want. Cork closed the folder, but didn't return it to the drawer. Will things ever be back to normal, Wally? Seems to me when you found this file cabinet, you latched onto a real Pandora's box. Now that you've opened it, can you close it again? Shawno looked uneasy. I don't know. I figure the worst is over. I'm not sure what purpose would be served by bringing all this to light. Seems like it would only lead to a lot of decent folks getting hurt. So far as I know, only you and me know what's in there. I'd just as soon keep it that way. He nodded toward the cabinet. Why don't you put the folder back, Cork? Cork slipped it in where he'd found it, then spotted a folder not far behind with the name Parent, S. He pulled the folder out. Cork, Shawno hollered. Cork ignored Shawno and opened the folder. God damn you, Cork, get out of there! Shawno was struggling to stand, grabbing at the crutches that leaned against the wall behind him. There were several photographs inside, shots like those he'd seen before, of trysting around Parent's hot tub. Although several different women were involved, none of them was Joe. Cork recognized a couple, Parent's secretary, Helen Barnes, Sue Jacobson, the chancellor of Aurora Community College. Unlike Joe, they weren't married. Cork noted quickly the time date at the bottom of each photo. They'd all been taken before Parent began his affair with Joe. From the looks of it, the man had been faithful, in his way. That there were no pictures of Joe surprised Cork, but he was also relieved since Shawno had undoubtedly already looked at the folder. Shawno grabbed the folder angrily from Cork's hands. His face was contorted with outrage and pain. That was uncalled for, damn you, Cork. I ought to have your sorry carcass thrown in jail. Shawno shoved the pictures back into Parent's folder and sat on the file cabinet. He squeezed his eyes shut a moment and held his leg. He breathed deeply, easing out the pain. When he opened his eyes again and looked at Cork, all the euphoria was gone. Get out of here before I have you arrested. Cork took his leather jacket from the coat tree and reached for the doorknob. Cork! Shawno's voice was ragged with irritation and pain. He'd moved himself onto his crutches and was leaning on them heavily. What would you do if you were me? I'd be tempted to burn them, Cork answered honestly. Save myself the worry over whose lives are ruined by what might come to light. But then, I'm not the sheriff, Wally, so I'm not even going to think about that. He left Shawano's office and checked with the desk officer on his way out. No one had found his revolver. Chapter 28. Maiden Cove was on reservation land just west of the state forest, formed by a rugged arm of dark gray rock that nearly cut off the small inlet from the rest of the lake. Accessible only by water and an unmarked inland trail, the cove was nearly invisible to those who didn't know where to look. It had always been a special place in Cork's thinking. Before his father was killed, they had often canoed in with Sam Wintermoon and camped there. Cork loved to jump off the gray rock that jutted up a dozen feet above the water. The cove was surprisingly deep. He had wonderful memories of the cool, still water in summer, and of swimming deep among the big rocks on the bottom, where the refracted sunlight turned everything a rich green gold. Life seemed simple then, the quiet of the woods and lake, a welcoming campfire, and the two men he loved most still alive. That's what Cork wanted. Everything simple again. With an ice spud, he chipped a hole 8 inches wide through ice that was more than half a foot thick. He cleared the ice chunks from the water with a plastic skimmer, then dropped a little vegetable oil onto the surface to keep the water from refreezing quickly. On a small Russian spoon, he put a grub, then sank it with a 2-pound test line. He settled himself on a folding canvas chair. Holding his jigging rod in one hand, he reached into the deep pocket of his coat and brought out a bottle of peppermint schnapps. He opened the bottle, but before he had a chance to take a drink, the grind of a snowmobile engine came from a long way off. He hoped it would move on, past the cove by. In a few minutes, all the rocks and trees rattled with the incessant whine of the little engine. Cork watched the snowmobile shoot through the narrow opening, swing toward him, and come to a stop a few yards away. It was an old machine, the oldest Cork knew of in Tamarack County. St. Kawasaki dismounted, lifted his goggles, and walked toward Cork. "What are you doing here?" Cork asked, not in a friendly way. "I thought you might need someone to talk to." He adjusted the black patch over his eye. "How'd you find me?" "Joe told me this was your favorite spot. I took a chance." Cork glanced behind him at the old Kawasaki. "I thought that machine was dead." The priest smiled and shrugged. "That's why I call it Lazarus." He saw the bottle in Cork's hand. "Mind if I take a shot of that? It's a long, cold way out here." Cork handed him the schnapps. The priest took a swallow and gave the bottle back. "Nice place," Tom Griffin said, surveying the cove. "I wasn't sure if I could find it. Are they biting?" "Not yet." Cork jigged the line, drawing the baited spoon upward several times. Then he let it settle back. "What are you fishing for?" the priest asked. "What are you?" Cork replied. St. Kawasaki smiled. "I thought you might need to talk." "Nothing to talk about. It's all settled. Bullets and lawyers. Between them, they've got a monopoly on the resolution of conflict." Cork took a long drink of schnapps, then handed the bottle back to the priest. "If everything's settled, what harm can a little talking do?" "What good can it do?" Cork pulled out his lucky strikes, took off his gloves, and lit a cigarette. "Let me ask you a question." "Shoot." "Do you believe in God?" St. Kawasaki looked amused. "Hell of a question to ask a priest." Cork carefully watched the end of his rod, a spring device that acted as a bobber. It hadn't moved at all in the time he'd been there. "I'm asking because I've been a cop most of my life, but I don't believe in justice anymore. I just wondered if the same was true in your work." "Why wouldn't it be? Priests are only human. We question, doubt, Even grow a little despondent at times because what the world shoves at us doesn't seem to bear much mark of the divine. The priest held the bottle toward the gray sky and squinted his one eye, as if making some kind of judgment about the schnapps. But in the end, I always come back to believing. Why? Why believe in something that continues to let you down? Like justice, eh? The priest drank and made a satisfied sound. Sure hits the spot, Cork. He looked down where Cork sat on the folding canvas chair. Everything disappoints us sometimes. Everybody disappoints us. Men let women down, women let men down. Ideals don't hold water. And God doesn't seem to give a damn. I can't speak for God, Cork, but I'll tell you what I think. I think we expect too much. Simple as that. And the only thing that lets us down is our own expectation. I used to pray to God for an easy life. Now I pray to be a strong person. I'm glad you found a prayer that works, Cork said. Think you can find your way back to town? Cork, the priest went on in a frank tone, I don't know if anybody's told you this, but you look like hell. I don't care, okay? Look, why don't you just jump back on Lazarus there and leave me the hell alone? In my experience, only dead men don't care. Then shake the hand of a ghost, Father. Cork shoved his hand up at the priest, who merely put the bottle of schnapps in it. I won't try to argue you out of this pit you've climbed into, Cork. But if you want to talk to someone, when you need to talk to someone, I'm willing to listen. I'll keep it in mind. Cork turned back toward the hole in the ice. The priest returned to Lazarus, kicked the old machine over, and guided it out of the cove. Cork listened until the sound of it was finally lost in the direction of Aurora. He finished his cigarette and threw the butt in the snow. He considered finishing the schnapps. Instead, he heaved the bottle as far as he could. Think, he told himself. Think like you've trained yourself to think. Think like a goddamn cop. Wally Shawno was satisfied. Russell Blackwater had done it all. Embezzled, killed Litton, then tried to kill him and Cork too. It worked. It was a safe assumption. But Cork felt it was wrong. It was too easy an answer, had come right out of the blue, handed over by Sigurd Nelson in the form of a small silver key that had been conveniently overlooked the night Litton died. He hauled up his line. Not even a nibble. Well, some days were like that. He threw his gear into the back of the Bronco. As he came around to the driver's side, he saw a huge black oil stain in the snow where the priest had parked the snowmobile. Lazarus was running again, but as always, running on borrowed time.
This ends Disc 6.